Mr. Whitfield. The card on file has been declined. Nothing about the venue director's tone rose above a murmur. Volume was never going to be necessary for that sentence. The band had just finished its last song before the cake, and 220 guests were watching a groom hold a black card the way a man holds a permission slip he is starting to suspect will not be signed. I was sitting at the back of the room, near the kitchen doors, in a navy dress I had picked specifically because it would not show up well in anyone's photographs. A glass of sparkling water sat by my elbow, still full. I already knew exactly what was about to happen. I had known for 1 week. I had spent the first 2 hours doing the thing I always do at weddings, even this one. I counted place settings. I noted which centerpieces had wilted faster than they should have in the heat. I watched a groomsman spill red wine near the head table and clocked, out of habit, how fast staff got a napkin over it. Old instincts do not turn off just because the wedding in front of you used to have your name on the invitations. Hartwell Estate does golden hour better than almost any venue in the county, and somebody on the planning side had gotten every detail right that night. String lights ran between 2 rows of live oak trees dripping with moss. The centerpieces were white hydrangea and eucalyptus, the kind of arrangement that looks simple and costs a small fortune precisely because it is not simple at all. I recognized the florist's work before I ever saw the invoice. I recognized the caterer's plating. I recognized the exact shade of ivory linen, because I had specified that same shade for a wedding of my own, 2 years earlier, at this same estate, for a ceremony that never happened. Grant's shoulders went stiff before his face caught up to them. "Run it again," he said, low, like volume alone could fix it. The venue director, a steady man named Ellison who had worked 11 weddings for my company before this one, took the card back and tried it a second time. The little machine on the cake table made the same short, flat tone. Ellison turned the screen so Grant could read it for himself. Account closed. Under those same string lights, my younger sister stood in front of a 5-tier cake in a gown that had cost more than my first car. In her free hand, she still gripped the blade they'd used minutes earlier to cut the first slice, catching light every time her fingers shook. Her face had not caught up yet, either. For one long second, she looked like a woman posing for a photograph nobody had taken yet, smiling out of pure habit while the rest of her expression tried to figure out what to do. I should say something before I tell you the rest of it. I did not walk into that reception to destroy anything. I walked in because I had already decided quietly, days earlier, that I was finished being the explanation for why things kept working out for people who never once asked whether I was all right. Closing an account takes one phone call. Learning to make that call, and meaning it, took me a great deal longer than that. It took the better part of a year, if I am being honest, though I would not have admitted that out loud until very recently. My name is Meredith Cole. For 15 years, I have run a company whose entire purpose is making other people's weddings look effortless. I know what a reception this size actually costs, down to the delivery fee on the flowers. I know how a vendor invoice is supposed to read before someone starts hiding numbers inside it. And I know exactly how a room sounds in the 4 seconds before 200 people realize, together, all at once, that something has gone very wrong. It is a specific kind of silence. It has a texture to it. That night I heard it from the inside for the first time in my career, and for once, none of it was my job to fix. That was the first invoice I collected that year. It was nowhere close to the last one. A few tables away. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. Somebody else set down a champagne glass a little too carefully, the way people do when they want to look like they are not watching something they are absolutely watching. Ellison leaned toward Grant and said something quiet about needing a different form of payment before service could continue. Grant did not answer him. He turned instead and scanned the room, table by table, past his own business partners, past our parents sitting at the head table, past 200 guests who had come to watch him promise forever to my sister in front of God, a live string quartet, and a photographer my sister had hired herself, without once asking me for a single recommendation. He was looking for someone to blame. I could see it happening across his face in real time, the way you can watch a man's mind work when he has run out of easier explanations. His eyes moved down the length of the room, past table after table of relatives who had known me since I was a child, until they landed on the one guest seated farthest from the stage, wearing the one dress in the entire reception that was not white, ivory, or gold. He found me. I did not look away. 220 people had come to watch my sister marry the man I once planned to marry myself, in a room decorated with the color palette I had chosen for my own wedding first. None of them understood yet that the collapse they were about to watch had already been decided a week earlier, in a 4-minute phone call that ended with one line before the woman on the other end hung up. "You have my permission to close it, ma'am. It's already done." It would take the rest of that night for the room to catch up to what I already knew. Grant crossed the room in maybe 15 steps. It felt longer because every single guest between the cake table and my chair turned to watch him do it. The band, unsure whether to keep playing through what was clearly not part of the reception timeline, let the last note die out and did not start another one. He came to a stop at my table, both palms pressed flat against the linen, leaning close enough that his voice was meant for me alone. It did not work. The room had already gone quiet enough that a dropped fork would have sounded like a gunshot. "What did you do?" he said. I looked up at him and let the question sit there for a second before I answered it, mostly because I wanted him to hear how calm my voice was going to be. "Nothing tonight," I said. "I did that a week ago." His jaw tightened. "That's my card." "No," I said, "it has your name on it. That's different from being yours." Somewhere behind him, I heard my sister's heels on the hardwood floor before I saw her, moving fast, holding the front of her gown off the ground with one hand so she would not trip on her way across the room to defend her almost husband. Paige arrived flushed, mascara already threatening at the corners of her eyes in a way I recognized from 20 years of watching her cry exactly enough to win an argument, and not one tear more. "Meredith," she said, "how could you do this to me? Today? Of all days?" I want to be fair to her. Even now, even knowing everything I know, Paige has always been good at sounding wounded. It is possibly her single greatest professional skill, more reliable than any camera filter she has ever used. She sounded, in that moment, exactly like a woman who had been blindsided by her own sister's cruelty in front of 200 witnesses. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I have found over many years of watching people try to bait me into a scene, that the quietest person in a loud room usually wins it. I closed my own account. I said, "I did not do anything to you." "You knew this would happen," she said. "You knew, and you let me stand up there and cut that cake without saying one word. And there it was." I let the sentence sit in the air for a moment before I answered, because I wanted every relative at every nearby table to have time to actually hear what she had just admitted out loud, in front of all of them, in her rush to be angry at me instead of careful. She had not asked whether I closed a joint account we still somehow shared after a divorce that never happened, because Grant and I were never married. She had asked whether I knew the card belonged to me, which meant she had always known it too. "How would I know a week ago what your wedding balance was going to be tonight?" I asked her, "unless somebody told me you were still using it." Paige's mouth opened and then closed again. Grant's eyes moved to her, fast, the particular kind of fast that happens when a man realizes his fiancée has just said something he needed her not to say, in a room full of people who were absolutely going to remember it. "I'm not doing this here," Paige said, too quickly. "You already did." I told her. Ellison, standing a respectful distance away with the venue's payment tablet still in his hand, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, careful and even, "the hotel has already received $152,000 toward the $210,000 contract. Through the deposit and the scheduled installments, the remaining $58,000 was due tonight, before the late course could be released." Nobody at our end of the room answered him. Grant's business partners had started murmuring behind their napkins. My mother, 3 tables closer to the stage, had gone very still in the particular way she goes still right before she decides to get involved in something. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to tell you I felt triumphant, and that would not be true. I felt tired, in the specific way you feel tired when you have been carrying something heavy for so long that your arms have forgotten what it is like not to ache. I had spent 6 days rehearsing versions of this conversation in my head, and not one of those versions had prepared me for how small my sister would look, standing in that dress, realizing in real time that the story she had built for herself did not survive contact with one sentence of the truth. Grant straightened up slowly. "Can we talk about this somewhere else?" he said, glancing at the nearest tables like the guests had suddenly become my responsibility to manage. "No," I said. "I don't think we can." Behind him. Paige had gone very pale, the kind of pale that has nothing to do with lighting. I looked past both of them, briefly, at the head table where our parents sat with Grant's parents beside them, 4 adults who had spent the last 20 minutes smiling for a video montage and were now watching their children's engagement unravel in real time over a payment terminal. My father had not moved. My mother's hand had gone to the edge of the tablecloth, gripping it the way she used to grip the dashboard when I was learning to drive. Somewhere in the back of the room, a photographer I recognized was very deliberately not taking a single picture. Her camera lowered against her chest like she understood, better than the 2 people standing in front of me, exactly how much this next hour was going to cost everyone at that reception. I need to back up, because none of what happened next will make sense unless you understand what my sister and I actually were to each other before that night, and why a piece of plastic with my name on it stayed in her wallet 3 years longer than it probably should have. I started Cole & Company events when I was 27, working out of a spare bedroom with a laptop, a rented steamer, and exactly 1 client willing to trust an unproven 27-year-old with her daughter's wedding. I remember standing in that client's backyard at 6 in the morning, pinning burlap to a rented arch with my own hands, because I could not yet afford a second person to help me, and thinking that if I could just get through that one Saturday, I would find a way to get through the next 115 years later. The company has a real office downtown, a staff of 11, and a waiting list that runs 8 months out during peak season. I built every bit of it myself, 1 contract at a time, while my father told anyone who would listen that event planning was a hobby that had gotten out of hand. Right up until the year my hobby made more money than his entire real estate portfolio, at which point he simply stopped mentioning it at dinner. Paige is 8 years younger than I am, which meant that by the time she was old enough to really understand what our family valued, I had already spent most of my childhood being the responsible one, and she had already learned that being adored required considerably less effort than being reliable. Our father used to introduce us at parties the same way every time, without seeming to notice he was doing it. "This is Meredith. She handles things. This is Paige. Isn't she lovely?" I do not say any of this with bitterness. I say it because it is simply true, and because it explains almost everything that came afterward. 3 years before that wedding. Paige was driving home from a friend's house on a wet road outside Savannah when a truck ran a red light and hit her car broadside. She spent 6 days in the hospital and the better part of a year in physical therapy afterward, relearning how to grip a steering wheel without her hand shaking, how to sit through an hour-long session without needing to lie down for the rest of the day. Our parents helped where they could. Our father wrote one check for the initial hospital deductible and then, true to form, treated the matter as handled. I had added Paige to my black card years before the accident, back when she was between jobs and needed a safety net more than she needed a lecture about budgeting. After the crash, that card became something else entirely. It became the thing that paid for a physical therapist twice a week for 14 months, without her having to ask our father for money and listen to him remind her every single time exactly how generous he was being. I kept her on that account on purpose. I want to be completely clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. I did not forget she was an authorized user. I did not lose track of the account the way people lose track of a gym membership. I made a decision, watched my sister flinch every time she reached for a coffee cup with her bad hand, and decided that whatever this cost me, it was not going to be the reason she skipped a session. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed the second night, when the pain medication had not fully caught up with what the accident had actually done to her. And she asked me, in a small voice I had not heard her use since she was maybe 9 years old, whether I thought she was going to be able to use her hand again the way she used to. I told her yes, because I did not know anything else to say to a person in that much fear, and because some version of it turned out to be true. She thanked me exactly once, about 8 months into her recovery, in a voice that sounded like it cost her something to use. After that, the thank yous got quieter. And then they stopped. The same way the receipts I used to get from her stopped. The same way most difficult things eventually get absorbed into the furniture of a family and nobody comments on them anymore. I do not regret keeping her on that card during those 14 months. I want that on the record, because everything that came after it is a completely separate story. And I refuse to let what she did later poison what I chose to do first. There is a version of this where I closed the account the day she was cleared by her doctor, and none of what happened at that reception ever touches me. I did not do that. I told myself I was being generous. Looking back, I think some part of me had simply gotten used to being the one who covers things, the way you get used to carrying a bag on one shoulder until you stop noticing the ache. I never imagined, sitting in a hospital waiting room 3 years earlier, that the same card keeping my sister upright would one day be the thing she used to marry the man I had planned to marry myself. Grant Whitfield walked into my life through a work site, not a bar or an app or a friend's dinner party, which I have always thought explained something about how solid our early years felt. I had booked his construction crew to renovate a carriage house behind one of my regular venues, a job that required someone who could restore original brick without making the whole space look like a museum exhibit. He showed up the first morning in work boots and a canvas jacket, took one look at my mood board, and told me, with a bluntness I was not used to from contractors, that half of it would not survive contact with a real building. He was right. I hired him again within a month, this time for a client. And within 6 months I had stopped pretending the reason I kept finding excuses to be on site had anything to do with brickwork. He proposed 2 years into dating. On a Tuesday, in the exact carriage house he had renovated for me. No crowd, no orchestrated surprise, just the two of us and a ring he had been carrying around in his jacket pocket for 11 days because he could not find, in his words, a moment that felt big enough. I said yes before he finished the sentence. For a while, it really was as simple as it sounds. The trouble did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way trouble usually arrives in a relationship between two ambitious people, which is to say quietly, through 100 small comments that none of us would have called a problem if you had asked us directly. Grant's business was steady but not large, 3 or 4 crews working residential renovations across the county. Mine had just landed its first venue partnership with Hartwell Estate. The kind of contract that changes how many zeros show up on your year-end statement. People at parties started introducing him as Meredith's fiancé before they got around to what he actually did for a living. And I watched something in his face tighten every single time it happened, even when he laughed it off. I offered, more than once, to bring his crew in on my venue jobs, thinking it would help, thinking 2 businesses under one roof was a strength instead of a scoreboard. He took the work. He also stopped mentioning it to his own father, who still believed his son was the primary contractor on those projects, rather than a subcontractor working for his fiancé's company. I found that out by accident, at a barbecue, when his father asked me what my little event company did to keep busy while Grant handled the real building work. I laughed along and did not correct him, because Grant's hand had found my knee under the table, gripping it hard enough that I understood the correction was not welcome. I did not understand, at the time, that I had accidentally handed him a wound and was now standing there confused about why it kept bleeding. We threw an engagement party that spring, at my mother's house, string lights in the backyard and a caterer I traded services with. Grant gave a toast that made half the room tear up, about finding someone who built things as carefully as he did, just in a different material. Paige gave her own toast right after his unplanned, standing up with a glass of wine she had refilled twice, and said that she had never seen her sister let anyone take care of her before, and she was glad Grant was the one who finally got the job. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. It took me a long time afterward to understand that the sentence had not entirely been a compliment. Paige started coming around more that same year, which felt, at first, like nothing but good news. My schedule during wedding season is brutal. 12 and 14-hour days from April through October, and having my sister nearby to keep Grant company on the nights I could not make dinner felt like exactly the kind of family closeness I had always wanted for the 3 of us. She picked up his dry cleaning when his schedule ran long. She sat through 2 of his father's birthday dinners when a site emergency kept me at Hartwell Estate until midnight. She told me, more than once, that she just wanted him to feel like somebody besides me was paying attention. I believed her completely. I want that on the record, too, because it is important for you to understand that I am not telling you this story as someone who suspected anything for a long time and simply chose not to look. I looked. I just did not know yet what I was looking at. The first small crack I actually noticed came at a dinner celebrating one of Grant's biggest contracts to date, a job I had personally connected him to through a developer client of mine. His payment on that job had not cleared yet, so I picked up the check without thinking twice about it, the way I picked up most checks in those years. From across the table. Paige lifted her glass and announced that she had never once doubted he would get there. Grant smiled at her, warm and easy, in a way he had not smiled at me all evening. In the car afterward, he told me I had humiliated him in front of people whose opinion mattered to his business. Reaching for the check the way I had, I apologized. He did not. Grant ended the engagement 14 months before that wedding, on a Sunday afternoon, sitting across from me at our own kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he never actually drank from. He said the words people say when they have already made a decision and are only looking for a way to make it sound mutual. We want different things. I feel like I have been performing a version of myself around you for years. You deserve somebody who does not feel small standing next to you. I did not fight him on it. I want to be honest about that, because I have turned it over enough times since to know it is true. Some part of me had felt it coming for months, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky actually changes color, and by the time he said the words out loud, I had already done most of my grieving in advance. I asked him to take his name off 2 joint accounts we had opened together for wedding expenses. I did not think even once to ask about the black card, because in my mind, that account had never belonged to our engagement in the first place. It belonged to my sister's recovery. It simply happened to have his name on it too, from an earlier year when I had added him as well, back when adding people I loved to that account was the easiest way I knew how to say I trust you with something that matters. He moved out within 3 weeks. I spent most of that first week alone in the house we had shared, packing his tools into the truck bed myself so I would not have to watch a stranger's hands touch them, cataloging which items had been his, which had been mine, which had somehow stopped mattering whose they were. Paige showed up on the 3rd day with coffee and boxes she did not need to buy, and helped him find a rental near downtown, and drove 2 carloads of his boxes across town herself. When I thanked her for being there for him during a hard transition, she told me she just could not stand to see either of us hurting and not do something useful with her hands. I believed that too. I remember being grateful, actually grateful, that at least one person in my family understood how to show up for both sides of a breakup without making either of us choose. It did not occur to me, not once, that showing up for both sides required a kind of access I had never questioned giving her. What I did not know, what I would not learn until months later, sitting in a dinner conversation I have not gotten to yet, was that somewhere in that same stretch of time, roughly 6 months before Grant ever sat me down at that kitchen table, my sister and my fiancé had already crossed a line neither of them ever planned to tell me about. I did not see it. I want to be precise about why I did not see it, because it would be easy for you to assume I simply was not paying attention, and that is not what happened. I was working 80-hour weeks that year, closing out our busiest wedding season yet. And the 2 people I trusted most to hold down the parts of my life I could not personally attend to were exactly the 2 people using my absence as cover. By the time Paige started planning her own wedding, less than a year after Grant moved out, I told myself the timeline made sense. 2 people who had comforted each other through my broken engagement, growing close, falling for each other honestly, after the fact. It is a better story than the truth. It is also, I would learn, not the true one. She never once asked me for a single piece of professional advice, not a venue recommendation, not a vendor contact, not even a candid opinion on a dress, despite the fact that I have built an entire career on exactly those decisions. I told myself that was kindness on her part, sparing me the discomfort of planning the wedding she assumed I still could not bear to think about. I have since had a great deal of time to consider a second explanation. She did not ask me because she already knew, somewhere underneath the story she was telling both of us, that I would eventually look closely enough to notice something was wrong with the picture, and the safest way to keep me from noticing was to keep me as far from the details as possible. She called every vendor herself, from the florist to the string quartet to the calligrapher who hand-lettered every place card. She picked every flower herself, drove out to inspect the hydrangea fields herself, sat through cake tastings without once inviting the sister who had judged 100 cake tastings professionally for other people's daughters. She built, in complete secrecy from the one person in her life whose entire profession was building exactly that kind of day. A wedding funded quietly through an account that still had my name stamped across the front of it. One invoice at a time, month after month. While I signed off on other people's happiness and never once thought to check my own statements closely enough to notice my own life quietly funding hers, at the time, I only thought she was being considerate, sparing me the sting of watching someone else plan the day I had once imagined for myself. I know better now. Considerate is not the word for a woman who plans an entire wedding around the exact blind spot she is counting on her sister never to check. That was the story I carried with me right up until the afternoon of the wedding itself, when I fastened a pair of earrings I had not worn in over a year, put on the navy dress, and drove myself to Hartwell Estate a little after 5 o'clock, alone, because I had decided weeks earlier that if I was going to walk into that building, I was not going to do it leaning on anyone else's arm. The lobby smelled the way it always smells during peak season. gardenia and candle wax, and the particular ozone hum of too many string lights plugged into one circuit. A quartet was tuning up near the staircase. An assistant I did not recognize was arranging an arch of white roses for arrival photos, and for 1 second, standing just inside the entrance, I forgot whose wedding I was actually walking into. My body simply registered a beautiful room and reacted the way 15 years of training had taught it to react, cataloging the florals, admiring the linen choice, noting that whoever had sourced the roses had paid a premium for out-of-season stock. Before my mind caught up and reminded me that none of it was mine to admire professionally that night. I had walked through this same lobby 100 times for other people's happiest days. I had never once walked through it feeling like the room itself was watching to see how I would hold up. A coordinator I half recognized checked names against a tablet near the ballroom doors. My table assignment came up on her screen before she said a word, and I watched her face do the small, involuntary thing faces do when they read something they were not quite prepared to say out loud to the person standing in front of them. "Table 22, she said. "All the way at the back, near the kitchen." Someone had written a note beside my name in the online seating chart, visible on her screen for half a second before she angled it away from me. "Family. Handle carefully." I didn't need her to explain what that meant. I had planned enough seating charts myself to know exactly what kind of instruction gets written next to a difficult guest's name. Sasha found me near the coat check, camera already around her neck, looking like she would rather have been anywhere else in the state of Georgia. Sasha Bell has shot nearly every major wedding I have personally coordinated for the last 6 years, and somewhere in that stretch of time she stopped being a vendor I hired and became one of the only people I trusted completely. Paige had hired her directly, without my referral, which told me something even then, though I did not let myself examine it too closely. "I didn't know you'd be here," Sasha said, low, glancing toward the ballroom doors like she expected someone to be listening. "I would have said something to you first if I'd known she was going to invite you. It's fine," I told her, and meant it. Mostly, "It is not fine," she said. "None of this is fine. I've been shooting this wedding for 3 months, and I still don't understand why nobody let you help plan a single piece of it. You could have done this whole thing better and cheaper, and nobody even asked." I did not have an answer for her that night. I have one now. Nobody asked me because the entire point, I would come to understand, was making sure I never got close enough to the invoices to notice whose name was actually paying for them. I was still standing near the coat check when my grandmother found me, moving slowly on the cane she pretends she does not need, wearing a deep green dress that made her look 20 years younger than 89. Eleanor Cole has never once, in my entire life, wasted words on a room she did not intend to read completely. "You look like you are bracing for something," she said, taking my hand in both of hers. I told her I was fine, the same automatic sentence I had just given Sasha, and she gave me the look she reserves for people who have just lied to her badly. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, "it is going to be fine eventually, even if it is not fine tonight. When this settles, I want you to come see me, just the two of us." There are some things I should have told you years ago, and I kept telling myself there was no rush. I asked her what she meant. She only patted my hand once, the way she has done since I was small enough to need steadying, and told me to go find my seat before the coordinator came looking for both of us. I did not think much of it in the moment. I had a great many other things on my mind that evening, and my grandmother has always spoken slightly in riddles, the way people do when they have spent 9 decades learning exactly how much truth a room can hold at one time. She had outlived one husband, buried a sister, and sat quietly through more family disagreements than anyone else still standing in that ballroom. And if there was one thing I had learned from watching her do it, It was that she never said a sentence she had not already turned over in her mind a dozen times first. It would be hours before I understood that she had just handed me the first thread of something far larger than the wedding I was about to sit through. And weeks before I understood how long she had been waiting for the right moment to hand it to me at all. Table 22 turned out to be exactly as far from the head table as the coordinator's face had warned me it would be, close enough to the kitchen doors that I could hear the caterers arguing quietly about a missing tray of crab cakes. Far enough from the dance floor that none of the family photographs later that evening would accidentally include me. I sat down between an empty chair reserved for someone who never showed, and a woman I recognized but could not immediately place, silver hair pinned up carefully, wearing the kind of tasteful navy dress that made mine look almost coordinated on purpose. "I'm Ruth," she said, extending a hand. "Your mother's cousin. I don't imagine you remember me. You were maybe 6 the last time I saw you properly, at your grandfather's funeral." I did remember her vaguely, the way you remember the edges of a memory rather than its center. Ruth Delaney had apparently kept in touch with my mother over the decades in the low, steady way certain relatives do, showing up at funerals and milestone birthdays and, evidently, weddings she seemed faintly surprised to have been invited to at all. She had the particular manner of a woman who had spent a career being underestimated in rooms full of men and had long since stopped minding, because it meant people said things in front of her they should not have. She studied the head table for a moment, the way a person studies a painting they suspect has been hung slightly crooked, then turned back to me with her wine glass still untouched. "I have to say," Ruth told me, glancing toward the head table where Paige was laughing at something Grant's business partner had said. "I was surprised to get an invitation to this one. So was I." I said, "Were you actually asked if you wanted to be here?" she said, "or just told where to show up?" I told her the truth, that I genuinely was not sure which it had been, and she made a small sound in her throat that I would later come to recognize as the sound Ruth makes when she has decided to say something she has been holding on to for a while. She asked, carefully, whether I would mind an old woman being direct with me, and I told her I generally preferred directness to whatever this evening was otherwise shaping up to be. "You don't have to answer this," she said. "But I have to ask, did all of this, whatever this ends up being tonight, did it start before your engagement actually ended, or after I felt the question land somewhere just beneath my ribs before I had even fully processed it?" I asked her what she meant, though some part of me already understood exactly what she meant. The way you understand a storm has arrived before you have consciously registered the sound of the rain. "I saw them together," Ruth said, "at your family's 4th of July gathering, the summer before your engagement ended. Not doing anything anyone could point to directly. But I have been to enough weddings and enough funerals in this family to know what two people who are trying too hard not to look at each other actually look like. I mentioned it to your mother once, carefully, and she told me I was imagining things, and I let myself believe her because it was easier than believing what I had actually seen. That 4th of July had been the summer before Grant sat me down at our kitchen table, 6 months before, if I was doing the math correctly, and some clinical, professional part of my brain, the part that reconciles vendor invoices for a living, was already doing that math whether I wanted it to or not. I asked her if she was certain of the timeline. I am 64 years old and I have very little left to lose by lying to you at a dinner table. Ruth said, "I am certain." I did not cry. "I want you to understand that, because I have thought about this moment often since, and I am somewhat proud of the fact that I simply sat very still, thanked her for telling me, and asked whether she would like more wine. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just absorbed a blow more gracefully than the blow deserved, and told me, quietly, that if I needed anything at all that evening, She would be sitting right there at table 22, and she was not going anywhere, across the room. Ellison had begun moving toward the cake table, tablet in hand, and the band was easing into the transition song that meant the reception's next act was about to begin. I thought, absurdly, of every timeline I had built for myself over the past 14 months, the tidy little story where Grant and I ended honestly and my sister and my ex-fiancé fell for each other honestly afterward. Two separate griefs that happened to heal into the same shape. Ruth had just taken that timeline apart with 9 words at a dinner table, and I could feel the wreckage of it settling somewhere behind my sternum. Patient, waiting for me to finish deciding what to do with it. I smoothed my napkin over my lap and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very certain. The particular stillness that comes right before you finally stop hoping a story you have been telling yourself might still turn out to be true. So no. I told Grant, standing in front of table 22 with 220 guests still watching, I don't think we can talk about this somewhere else. I think we can talk about it exactly here. Paige's hand found his sleeve. Meredith, please, she said, her voice dropping into the register she uses when she wants a room to think she is the reasonable one. Whatever you think happened between us, this is not the time. You're right, I said. It is not the time to discuss whatever you think happened. It is, however, an excellent time to discuss what I know happened, since you brought it up in front of everyone yourself a few minutes ago. I watched something in Grant's face go very still. Paige's grip on his sleeve tightened. I sat next to a woman tonight who has known this family for longer than either of you have been alive, I said. She told me she saw the two of you together at a 4th of July gathering. The summer before Grant and I ended our engagement, not doing anything anyone could point to directly, just standing a little too close for a little too long, in the specific way two people stand when they have already stopped being careful enough. Paige's face did the thing faces do when a person is deciding, in real time, whether to lie to a room full of witnesses or say nothing at all and let the silence answer for them. She chose the silence. It answered louder than anything she could have said. That's not, Grant started and then stopped because he did not actually have a way to finish the sentence that was not itself another lie, and some deeply buried professional part of him, the part that has closed enough contracts to know when an argument is already lost, seemed to understand that continuing would only make it worse. I watched him look at Paige, just once, a look that was less about affection than about calculation, the specific expression of a man checking whether his partner was going to back him up or leave him standing there alone. She did not look back at him. She was watching me instead. The way you watch a bill you know you cannot pay arrive in the mail. I had rehearsed 100 versions of this exact moment over the past 6 days, lying awake at 2 a.m, running through every possible way it could go. In none of those versions had I imagined how quiet the room would actually get, or how far a whisper could travel across 200 people who had all, without seeming to move at all, leaned very slightly closer to hear it. I want to be precise here. Because precision matters to me and because I think it will matter to you. I did not close that account because my sister is marrying my ex-fiancé. People fall in love in complicated, overlapping, imperfect timelines all the time. And if that were the whole of it, I like to think I would have found some way to make peace with it eventually, however long that took. I closed it because I discovered you built an entire relationship inside the wreckage of mine while I was still standing in it. And then let me spend 6 more months believing I had simply failed at something honestly. Louise had come to stand a few feet away by then, her hand pressed flat against her collarbone, watching her 2 daughters and the man who had almost married one of them, with an expression I had never seen on my mother's face before. Not shock exactly, Something closer to grief for a version of her family she had apparently been quietly mourning for longer than she had ever told me. Across the room, I saw my father rise from the head table, not toward me, toward the small, tightening circle where I stood with Grant and my sister, moving with the particular unhurried authority of a man who has spent his entire life believing that his presence alone is usually enough to end an argument before it finishes saying something inconvenient. I did not wait for him to arrive before I said the last thing I needed to say to Grant directly. "You don't have to answer for any of it to me tonight," I told him. "You already answered it, the day you decided that keeping me in the dark for 6 months was easier than telling me the truth and letting me decide what to do with it. I'm not angry that this happened. I'm angry that I was the last person in this family to find out." Paige finally found her voice again, thin and shaking. "You're going to ruin this, in front of everyone, over something that happened months ago." "It's not ruined because I said it out loud," I told her. "It was ruined the moment it happened. I just refused to be the only one who didn't know." My father reached us then, moving through the crowd the way he always has, as though every room existed primarily to make space for him when he finally decided to enter it. He was still in the tuxedo he had worn for the father of the bride dance rehearsal that afternoon, his tie slightly loosened, his expression already arranging itself into the particular blend of concern and authority he reserves for moments he intends to control. I had watched him wear that same expression at 2 funerals, 1 bankruptcy hearing, and every single disagreement I could remember from my childhood onward. It had worked on me for most of my life. I found myself curious, almost clinically so, whether it was going to work on me tonight. The particular quality of the silence around our small circle told me, before he even opened his mouth, that whatever came next was not going to make anything simpler. "Meredith," my father said, in the tone he uses when he wants a disagreement to sound like it is already over. "This is your sister's wedding. Whatever is going on between the 3 of you, is this really the hill you want to cause a scene on? In front of 200 people, I did not cause this." I told him I closed an account that belonged to me, your daughter, and the man she is marrying decided to build an entire wedding on top of it without telling me. And now the bill has come due in front of everyone they invited to watch them not pay it. "That's not fair," Paige said, finding her voice again now that our father was standing beside her. "You make it sound so calculated. I just wanted one day where things went right for me for once." "One day," I repeated. "Paige, you have been planning this wedding for the better part of a year, using my card, with the man I was engaged to. And you are telling this room you just wanted one day." My father's jaw tightened. The exact same motion I had watched cross Grant's face 20 minutes earlier. And I understood, in that moment, precisely where Grant had learned to wear it. "Your sister has been through enough," he said. "The accident, the recovery. She does not need you making her happiness into a referendum on old grievances." "I want to be very clear about something," I told him. And I made sure my voice carried the full length of that circle of guests, because I was done letting this conversation happen only in whispers. I paid for 14 months of physical therapy after that accident, without asking a single person in this family for $1, including you. I have never once used what I did for Paige as a weapon against her, and I am not using it as one now. What I will not do is stand here and let generosity from 3 years ago be used as an excuse for what she did to me this year. Louise had gone very still beside my father, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it did not shake at all. "Walter," she said, "don't you dare stand here and make this about gratitude. Meredith didn't do anything except stop paying for a wedding nobody had the decency to tell her she was funding. If anyone in this family owes anyone an apology tonight, it is not her. I had not expected her to say it in front of everyone. I do not think, looking back, that my mother had expected to say it either. She had spent so many years being the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the woman who smoothed things over so the rest of us never had to sit in the discomfort of an actual disagreement. And something about watching her own daughters standing in the wreckage of that ballroom seemed to have finally used up whatever reserve of silence she had left. My father turned to look at her, genuinely surprised. The way a man looks when a piece of furniture he has never once questioned suddenly speaks. In 44 years of marriage, I do not think I had ever once heard my mother raise her voice to him in front of other people. She had built an entire personality around softening the edges of every room he walked into, translating his bluntness into something the rest of us could live with, absorbing disagreements before they ever had the chance to become arguments. I had spent my whole life assuming that was simply who she was. Standing there that night, I understood for the first time that it might have been who she had decided, a long time ago. It was safer to become Louise, he said, and stopped, because he did not appear to have a second sentence ready. She did not wait for him to find one. I have watched you excuse this family's favorite daughter out of every consequence she has ever earned since she was old enough to earn one, Louise said. I let it happen more times than I am proud of, because it was easier than fighting you over it at every holiday dinner. I am not doing it tonight. Not in front of 200 people. And not for something this serious. I am not trying to destroy this wedding, I said, before he could recover enough to answer her. I want everyone in this room to understand that clearly, because I know how this is going to sound to some of you. I did not sabotage anything. I did not plan a scene. I simply stopped financing one. The band, which had been quietly vamping through an instrumental version of something meant for the father-daughter dance, finally lost whatever nerve had kept them playing through the last 10 minutes, and the music dropped away into nothing. In the sudden quiet, I heard 3 separate chairs scrape back at nearby tables as guests stood, phones already rising, faces arranging themselves into the particular mixture of horror and fascination that a room wears when it understands, all at once, that the wedding it came to watch is no longer the wedding actually being performed in front of it. Paige looked around at the standing guests, at the abandoned dance floor, at the silent band, and I watched the exact moment she understood that whatever happened next, this night was never going to be remembered the way she had spent a year planning for it to be remembered. By 9:40, most of the guests had made the same quiet calculation and decided that leaving was kinder than staying to watch the rest of it unfold. Ellison moved through the room with the careful efficiency of a man who has managed exactly this kind of evening before, though I doubt even he had managed one quite like this. The premium bar closed. The late-night food service, the seafood station Paige had specifically requested against Ellison's gentle advice, never made it out of the kitchen at all. Grant spent the better part of 20 minutes on his phone near the coat check, first with his bank, then with his father, who I gathered from the one-sided conversation was not offering to cover the remaining balance either. My father did not offer either. He stood near the head table with his hands in his pockets, watching his younger daughter's wedding come apart, and did not once step forward to write a check that would have ended the crisis in under a minute. I understood, watching him, that this was not generosity withheld out of principle. It was simply the first time in Paige's life that a consequence had arrived faster than someone in this family could intercept it on her behalf. I did not stay to watch the rest. There is a version of that night where I could have lingered, could have let myself enjoy however much satisfaction there was to be found in watching a room I had spent a career building for other people fall apart for my sister instead. But I found, once the worst of it was over, that I simply wanted to go home. Paige did not approach me again before I left. I saw her once more, near the emptying dance floor, still in the ivory gown, her veil pushed back off her face, standing very alone in the middle of a room that had been built entirely around the idea of her not being alone in it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years being her older sister before it had spent one night being her creditor, wanted to cross the room and put a hand on her shoulder. I did not. I was not yet ready to know what I would say if I did. Sasha caught me near the exit, her camera finally lowered for good, and told me she was sorry for all of it, for taking the job in the first place without knowing what she was walking into. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She had not built the lie. She had only been standing close enough to photograph it. I drove to my mother's house instead of my own, the way I have done since I was 17 years old, and needed somewhere quiet to sit with something too large to carry alone. Louise did not ask me a single question when I came through her kitchen door, still in my navy dress. She simply put a pot of water on the stove, pulled a block of cheese and a loaf of bread from the refrigerator, and made me a grilled cheese sandwich the way she has made me grilled cheese sandwiches after every hard thing that has ever happened to me. From a failed algebra test at 14 to the afternoon, Grant moved his boxes out of our house. We sat at her small kitchen table, the same one I had done homework at as a child, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. It was, strangely, the first real quiet I had felt in 6 days. "You did the right thing," she said eventually, not looking up from her own plate. I told her I was not sure yet whether it had been right, only that it had been necessary. And she said that in her experience those two things were more often the same thing than people wanted to admit. I thought for one unguarded moment that the worst of it might genuinely be behind me. I had closed an account. I had told the truth in a room that badly needed to hear it. I had watched my mother stand up for me in a way she had never once managed to do in 42 years of my life, and some small, exhausted part of me was ready to call that a complete victory and go to sleep. My phone buzzed against the table before I had finished the thought. A name I did not immediately place lit up the screen, attached to a message that made no sense to me yet, something about a deposit discrepancy and a vendor I had never personally worked with. I remember frowning at it, setting the phone face down, and telling my mother it could wait until morning. It could not. As it turned out, wait until morning. I finished the rest of the sandwich, kissed my mother goodnight, and drove home to an apartment that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely and uncomplicatedly mine. I slept better than I expected to. I would learn within 12 hours that I had spent that entire evening so focused on the sister standing in front of me that I had not noticed the second bill was already in the mail, drafted by someone considerably more patient than Paige had ever been, and considerably more dangerous than I understood yet how to be afraid of. I had closed one account. I did not yet know how many more of my own signatures were sitting in files I had never personally opened. The message that pulled me out of my mother's kitchen the next morning came from a woman named Carol Whitmore, whose daughter's wedding my company had booked for the following spring at a total contract value of $180,000. I did not know her well. I had met her twice, both times briefly, both times pleasant. There was nothing pleasant in her voice when I finally called her back at 8:15 that morning. "Somebody needs to explain to me right now," she said, "why the event protection deposit I paid your company 6 months ago apparently does not exist." I asked her, as calmly as I could manage on 4 hours of sleep, to walk me through exactly what she meant. She explained that her vendor coordinator, one of my own staff, had flagged a scheduling conflict with the backup catering service listed on her contract, a service meant to be guaranteed under something called an event protection rider, an add-on package my company had apparently sold her for $22,000. When she called the protection vendor directly to confirm their availability for her daughter's date, the phone number on file did not connect to any business. It connected to a voicemail box that had never been set up. I did not have an event protection rider in my standard contract templates. I want to be precise about that, because it matters enormously to what came next. My company sells wedding planning services, vendor coordination, day of management. We had never once, in 15 years, sold a client a separate insurance product against vendor no-shows, because in 15 years I had never needed one. My reputation in this town had been built brick by brick on the promise that if something went wrong with a vendor, I fixed it personally, quietly, before the bride ever had to hear about it. That promise did not require a $22,000 line item. It required a phone and a list of backup florists I kept updated every single season. I told Carol Whitmore I would look into it personally and call her back within the hour. She told me, not unkindly, that she had also already spoken to an attorney, and that the hour I was asking for had better produce something more useful than an apology. I did not blame her for the tone. If I had paid $22,000 for a guarantee and discovered the guarantee was a disconnected voicemail box, I would have called an attorney too. I drove to my office instead of finishing breakfast. My assistant, who had been with me for 6 years and had never once seen me arrive before 9, took one look at my face and asked no questions, just handed me a coffee and stepped back from her desk to let me get to mine. I pulled Carol Whitmore's file first. There it was, exactly as she had described it, a line item dated 8 months earlier reading Event Protection Services, $22,000, paid to a vendor called Coastal Event Assurance, LLC. I had never heard the name in my life. I searched my own vendor database for it and found nothing. No contact information, no service agreement, no history of past bookings. It existed only as a line in an invoice, approved, according to the digital record, under my own electronic signature. I sat very still at my desk for a long moment. The way you sit still when your body understands something is wrong before your mind has finished assembling the shape of it. My assistant knocked once, softly, to ask whether I wanted the Whitmore file pulled up on the conference room screen instead, and I remember answering her in a voice that did not sound entirely like my own, telling her to close my door and hold every call that was not Carol Whitmore herself. I searched further back. Coastal Event Assurance, LLC appeared again and again, scattered across 6 years of client files, always in amounts that looked reasonable in isolation. 3,000 here, 8,000 there. Never large enough on its own to trigger the kind of internal review that would have flagged a genuinely new expense category. I opened a spreadsheet and started listing every instance I could find, and somewhere around the 9th line item, a memory surfaced that I had not thought about once since the previous night. Keep the books nice and tidy this quarter, won't you? My Aunt Deborah had said it to me at the reception, lightly, over a glass of champagne, in the specific tone people use when they are testing whether a sentence will land as a joke or as a threat, and want the option of claiming it was only ever the former. I had laughed it off at the time, the way you laugh off anything a relative says at a party that lands slightly wrong, filing it under family strangeness rather than warning. Deborah has always had a particular gift for saying exactly the things she means while sounding like she means nothing at all. I had spent 30 years mistaking that gift for wit. I stopped laughing at my desk that morning, looking at a company I had built with my own 2 hands for 15 years, realizing that somewhere inside its finances, something had been quietly bleeding for far longer than I had any idea how to measure yet. My hand was not quite steady when I picked up the phone to call Nora. I dialed her direct line instead of the office number, because whatever this was, I did not yet trust it to a receptionist's hold queue. Nora picked up on the second ring, the way she has answered my calls since our first year of law school together, when we were both too broke to let a phone ring 3 times without assuming the worst. I told her everything: Carol Whitmore, the phantom vendor, the electronic signature that supposedly belonged to me on an invoice I had never seen. She let me finish without interrupting once, which is not her usual style, and that alone told me how seriously she was taking it. "Send me the spreadsheet you've started," she said. "Everything you found so far. And Meredith, do not call your aunt before you talk to me again. I mean that." I promised her I would not, though some smaller, angrier part of me had already been composing the phone call in my head on the drive to the office. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best under pressure, which is turning chaos into an organized list. I pulled every invoice referencing Coastal Event Assurance LLC I could find in our accounting system, going back as far as the records allowed, and built a timeline. The earliest entry was from just over 6 years ago. The most recent had posted 4 months before Paige's wedding. None of the amounts were large enough, on their own, to have tripped any alarm. That was, I understood by the 3rd hour, precisely the point. A $22,000 line item on a $180,000 wedding does not look like theft. It looks like a reasonable add-on service, the kind of thing a bride's mother signs off on without a second glance because everything else on the invoice already sounds expensive and official. I built a second column in my spreadsheet listing every client whose file contained a Coastal Event Assurance entry, and by the time I finished, the number sat at 19 separate weddings across 6 years, an average of just over $9,000 each, small enough individually to read as reasonable, large enough together to make my stomach turn every time I refreshed the total at the bottom of the column. I thought about every one of those 19 brides, women I had personally promised a wedding day with no ugly surprises, discovering years from now, the way Carol Whitmore just had, that a piece of what they paid for had never actually existed. I called our bookkeeper, a careful, quiet woman named Priya who has managed our accounts payable for 9 years, and asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether she had ever personally verified Coastal Event Assurance, LLC as a vendor before authorizing a payment to them. She went quiet on the other end of the line for long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it. "Deborah told me it was one of your father's contacts," Priya said finally, "from back when you were first starting the company and needed vendors who'd extend credit terms to a new business. She said you'd cleared it personally and just didn't want to be bothered with the paperwork every time, since it was a recurring account. I'm sorry, Meredith. I should have asked you directly at some point instead of taking her word for it. I told Priya she had nothing to apologize for. Deborah had been coming to our office for over a decade by then, sitting in on quarterly reviews, offering opinions on hiring decisions, occupying exactly the kind of quiet, permanent authority that nobody questions because nobody remembers a time before it existed. She had earned that access the same way water earns a path through stone, patiently, one small erosion at a time, until the shape of the thing looks inevitable rather than deliberate. I asked Priya to pull the original approval trail for the very first Coastal Event Assurance payment, the one from 6 years back. It showed my electronic signature, time-stamped to a Tuesday afternoon I would later be able to prove through my own calendar. I had spent entirely on a venue walk through 2 hours outside Savannah, nowhere near a computer capable of authorizing anything. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. It was the first piece of proof I had that this was not a misunderstanding, or an old family favor gone slightly stale. It was a signature I had never made, on a document I had never seen, dated to an hour I could account for down to the minute. I thought back to the comment at the reception again, turning it over from every angle I could manage. "Keep the books nice and tidy this quarter, won't you?" At the time, it had sounded like nothing. A throwaway pleasantry from a woman who had drunk 1 glass of champagne too many at a family wedding. Sitting in my office that afternoon, staring at 6 years of quietly bleeding invoices, it sounded like something closer to a warning shot fired by someone who already knew exactly what I was about to find whenever I finally got around to looking. I closed my laptop and called Nora back. "We need someone outside this building," I told her. "Someone who has never met my aunt and doesn't owe this family a single ounce of loyalty. I know exactly who to call." Nora said. "Give me until tomorrow morning." I hung up the phone and sat in my office long after everyone else had gone home. The city outside my window turning gold and then gray, and made myself do the one thing I had been avoiding since Carol Whitmore's call that morning. I opened the folder of family photographs I keep on a shelf behind my desk, the ones clients like to see when they come in for consultations. Proof that the woman planning their wedding believes in the institution herself. Deborah was in half of them, every holiday, every birthday, smiling in the front row like a woman who had never once taken anything from anyone. Nora called back the following morning before I had finished my coffee and told me she had already spoken with a forensic accountant named Victor Reyes, a man she had worked with twice before on cases involving exactly this kind of slow, patient siphoning inside a family business. She warned me before she gave me his number that Victor did not soften anything for his clients, and that if I hired him, I needed to be prepared to see the full shape of whatever this turned out to be, not just the parts I was emotionally ready for. I told her I would rather know the whole truth badly than a comfortable version of it slowly. Victor arrived at my office 2 days later, a compact, unhurried man in his 50s who shook my hand once, firmly, and then spent the first 20 minutes of our meeting not speaking at all, simply reading through the spreadsheet I had built and the sample invoices I had pulled. He had a way of turning each page with exactly the same unhurried motion, as though nothing on it could surprise him, which I would later learn was less a personality trait than a professional discipline. He told me once, much later, that a forensic accountant who lets his face react to what he finds has already told the room too much before he has confirmed a single fact. I found his silence unnerving in a way I had not expected. I run a company built on making people feel reassured within minutes of meeting me. My entire professional instinct is to fill silence, smooth it over, offer a solution before the client has finished describing the problem. Victor clearly did not consider reassurance part of his job, and sitting across from someone who refused to perform comfort at me was, I realized partway through those 20 minutes, oddly clarifying. Nobody was going to tell me this was going to be fine until it was actually, provably, fine. "This is going to take longer than a spreadsheet," he said finally, closing his folder. Whoever built this pattern understood exactly how internal controls work at a company your size. Amounts small enough to avoid mandatory review thresholds. A vendor name generic enough to blend into 100 other line items. Timing spread out enough that no single quarter ever looked unusual on its own. This is not somebody getting greedy and sloppy. This is somebody who has done this before, or studied someone who has. I asked him how long he would need. 2 weeks for a preliminary picture. He said, "Longer if I need to subpoena bank records outside our voluntary access. I want full read access to 6 years of statements, not just the ones touching this vendor. If there's more than one thread here, I want to find all of them before we show our hand to anyone." I signed the engagement letter that afternoon in Nora's office, with Nora standing over my shoulder reading every clause twice before I was allowed to put my signature anywhere near it. I remember feeling, as I wrote my name, a strange, small vertigo at the idea of hiring a stranger to excavate my own family's finances, as though I were commissioning an autopsy on someone who had not yet agreed she was dead. Nora must have seen something in my face, because she paused before I signed and asked whether I wanted to stop, whether there was still a version of this where I simply absorbed the loss quietly and never opened that particular door. I told her no. I had spent enough of my life absorbing things quietly on other people's behalf. Victor asked one more question before he left that day, one that stayed with me for the full 2 weeks that followed. "Is there anyone in this company, or this family, who has ever had unsupervised access to your approval credentials?" he asked. "Not suspected, confirmed access, I need names, not instincts. I gave him 3 names. My assistant, who had full calendar visibility, but no financial authority. Priya, who processed payments but had never once, in 9 years, initiated one without a second signature. And Deborah, who had held a standing seat on our advisory account since the earliest days of the company. Back when I had needed her signature as often as my own simply to keep the lights on. Victor wrote her name down without comment, the same flat, unreadable expression he had worn through the entire meeting, and told me he would be in touch within the week with an initial read on the pattern. I did not sleep well for the 2 weeks that followed. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though I moved through it with the same steadiness I managed at the reception. I did not. I lay awake more nights than I want to count, doing math in the dark, trying to guess at a number I was not remotely prepared for. I kept the investigation from Louise during those 2 weeks, telling her only that there had been a billing issue at the office that Nora was helping me sort out. It was not a full lie. It also was not the truth, and I felt the weight of that omission every time she called to ask how I was holding up after the wedding, assuming, reasonably, that Paige was still the largest thing occupying my thoughts. I did not yet know how to tell my mother that the sister who had betrayed me might not even be the most dangerous person sitting at our family's holiday table. I was not certain. Some nights, that I believed it myself. Other nights, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, I was fairly certain I already did. Carol Whitmore did not wait quietly for me to resolve things on my own timeline, and I do not fault her for that. A woman who has just learned that a piece of her daughter's wedding safety net never existed does not owe the vendor who sold it to her the benefit of patient silence. Within a week, she had mentioned the situation to 2 other mothers in her social circle, both of whom happened to have daughters getting married through my company within the next 18 months. I found out the way you find out most things in the wedding industry in a city the size of Savannah, sideways, through someone who assumed I already knew. A florist I have worked with for a decade called to ask, with obvious discomfort, whether it was true that Cole & Company Events was under investigation for fraud. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that there was no investigation targeting my company, that I was the one who had discovered the discrepancy and reported it myself, and that I intended to make every affected client completely whole. She said she believed me. I could hear, underneath the reassurance in her voice, the particular caution of someone deciding how much of that belief she was willing to repeat to her other clients. 2 days after that call, a bride I had been working with for 8 months, a sweet, anxious young woman planning a spring wedding at a vineyard outside the city, emailed to say that she and her fiancé had decided to go in a different direction with their planning, effective immediately. She did not mention Carol Whitmore by name. She did not need to. The subject line alone told me everything the email itself was too polite to say directly. I read it 3 times before I let myself reply, because my first instinct, honed by 15 years of smoothing over other people's anxiety, was to call her personally and talk her out of it. I made myself stop. Talking a frightened client out of her fear before I had actually fixed the thing, frightening her would have been exactly the kind of quiet, over-functioning rescue I was trying to stop performing for people who had not earned it. I wrote back a short, professional note wishing her well, and let the account go. By the end of that week, 2 more inquiries had gone quiet without explanation. The kind of silence that in my industry usually means a couple has simply moved on to another planner without bothering to say so directly. I watched my calendar, normally booked 8 months out, develop small, visible gaps where consultations used to sit, and understood that reputational damage does not always arrive as a single dramatic blow. Sometimes it arrives as a slow erosion of small, ordinary appointments, one quiet cancellation at a time, until you look up one afternoon and realize the shape of your business has changed without anyone ever telling you to your face. I sat with that cancellation longer than I probably should have, given everything else demanding my attention that week. 15 years of reputation, built one careful, over-delivered wedding at a time, and it had taken exactly 9 days of rumor to put a visible crack in it. I understood, watching that crack spread, precisely what kind of danger I was actually standing in. This was never only going to be about the money Deborah had taken, it was going to be about whether Cole and Company events survived being associated with the word fraud at all, regardless of who had ultimately committed it. I called an emergency meeting with my full staff that same afternoon, 11 people who had built careers alongside mine, some of them for as long as a decade, and told them as much of the truth as I legally could at that stage. An internal financial irregularity had been discovered. I had hired independent investigators. Any client with concerns should be directed to me personally, not left to speculate with each other in the break room or, worse, with clients over the phone. My events director, a sharp, steady woman named Camille who has been with me since year 3, asked the question everyone else in the room was clearly thinking and too polite to voice. "Is the company going to survive this?" she asked. I told her the truth because I have always believed my staff deserved better than false comfort. "I don't know yet," I said. "I know I am not going to let it die quietly while someone else decides how the story gets told. That is the only part I can promise you today." Nobody in that room looked especially reassured. I was not especially reassured myself, but something in stating it plainly, out loud, in front of the people who had built this company alongside me, made the fear feel slightly more like a problem I intended to solve, and slightly less like a wave about to take the whole building down with it. Camille stayed behind after the others filed out, closing the door quietly behind her. She has known me long enough to read the difference between the version of an update I give a room and the version I am actually carrying. "Whatever this is," she said, "however bad it gets, I want you to know none of us think it's you. We've seen how you run this place." I did not trust myself to answer that without my voice breaking, so I simply nodded and thanked her, and let her leave before I allowed myself the 2 minutes alone at my desk that I badly needed by then. Victor asked to meet in person for his preliminary findings, not over the phone, which told me before he said a single word how serious the shape of it had become. He arrived at Nora's conference room with a folder considerably thicker than the one he had carried into our first meeting, and laid 3 documents on the table before he sat down, arranging them the way a surgeon arranges instruments before beginning something irreversible. "Coastal Event Assurance, LLC," he said, "is registered in South Carolina to a woman named Renata Ashford, your aunt's late husband's niece, according to public filings. The registered address is a mailbox rental facility in Hilton Head. There is no office. There are no employees on any payroll record I can locate. There is no business license for event insurance services in either Georgia or South Carolina under that name." He let that sit in the air for a moment before continuing, watching me the way I imagine he watches every client at this exact point in a case, gauging how much detail I could absorb before he moved to the next document. I told him to keep going. I had not driven across town and rearranged my entire afternoon to be handled gently. I asked him whether Deborah's name appeared anywhere directly. "Not on the incorporation documents," he said. "That would have been careless, and nothing about this pattern reads as careless. But the banking trail tells a different story. Every disbursement from Coastal Event Assurance, every single one, over 6 years, flows within days into an account jointly held by Renata Ashford and Deborah Cole Ashford. Your aunt is not named as the owner of the shell company. She is, however, the only person who has ever actually received the money." He slid the second document across the table. A printed ledger with amounts highlighted in yellow running down 2 full pages. $187,000, he said. That is the confirmed total across 6 years and 19 client files, verified against your accounting system and cross-referenced with the receiving account. I want to be clear that this is the confirmed number. There may be more in years your system does not retain clean records for, but I am not comfortable representing anything beyond what I can prove to this exact standard. I sat with that number for a long moment, watching it refuse to become any less real the longer I looked at it. My own rough count, done alone at my desk 2 weeks earlier with a calculator and a growing sense of dread, had landed somewhere near 170,000, close enough to feel validating, and far enough off to remind me I had been guessing, not knowing. None of my guessing had prepared me for how strange it actually felt to see the real figure finally printed on a page, precise to the dollar, next to a name I had called Aunt Deborah at every holiday dinner of my adult life. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, every single one of Paige's birthdays going back to when Paige was still small enough to sit on Deborah's lap during the cake. The third document, Victor said, sliding it forward last, is the one you are going to find hardest to look at. It was a comparison of digital signature metadata, the approval trail on 9 separate coastal event assurance invoices set beside my actual calendar and location records for those same dates. Every single one showed my electronic signature applied from an IP address associated with our office network. At times when my calendar, corroborated by client meeting notes, GPS data from my company vehicle, and in 2 cases, a still existing text message thread, placed me somewhere else entirely. Someone with administrative access to your approval system generated these signatures without your involvement, Victor said. That is not a theory. That is what the metadata shows, conclusively, to a standard that would hold up under real scrutiny. I asked him the question I had been afraid to ask since the moment he sat down. Could Deborah, if this ever became public, claim the opposite? Claim that I had known, that I had signed off personally, that the entire scheme had my quiet blessing all along. She could claim it. Victor said, claims are free, but a forged signature applied while your calendar places you 2 counties away, corroborated by 3 independent sources, does not survive a real audit. If she tries that defense, it will not hold. I would not have brought you this document today if I thought it would. I found that I believed him more completely than I had believed almost anyone in the 6 weeks since Carol Whitmore's phone call. There was something almost restful in his flatness, in his refusal to soften a single fact for my comfort. I had spent so long surrounded by people who managed my feelings around difficult information that a man willing to simply hand me the truth, unpadded, felt less like cruelty and more like the first honest kindness anyone had offered me in a very long time. Nora, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke. This is not just an internal personnel matter anymore. Meredith, this is wire fraud and forgery committed against your company using your identity for 6 consecutive years. You need to decide soon exactly how far you want to take this. I looked at the yellow highlighted total on the 2nd page one more time before I answered her. I want to talk to her myself first, I said, before anything else happens. She owes me that conversation, even if I don't owe her the courtesy of having it privately. Deborah lives in a restored townhouse a few blocks off Forsyth Park, the kind of address that photographs beautifully for the historic home tours she has hosted twice a year for as long as I can remember. She opened the door herself, in a silk robe, a glass of white wine already in hand at 4 in the afternoon, and looked at me the way you look at a delivery you were not quite expecting, but are not entirely surprised to see either. Meredith, she said, stepping back to let me in without asking why I had come. I wondered when you would work up to this. I did not sit down when she gestured toward her living room, all soft cream furniture and family photographs in silver frames, several of which I noticed for the first time with a strange, distant clarity, included me at ages I could no longer quite place. 8 years old at a beach house, 16 at my own high school graduation. Deborah's arms slung easily around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something neither of us could probably remember now. I had spent my whole life assuming those photographs meant what photographs are supposed to mean. Standing in her living room that afternoon, I understood I no longer had any idea what they meant, or whether they had ever meant what I assumed. I told her, without preamble, that I knew about coastal event assurance, about Renata, about 6 years and 19 client files and $187,000 that had never once been hers to take. She did not flinch. I want you to understand that, because I think it tells you more about her than almost anything else I could describe. She simply set her wineglass down on a coaster, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me with an expression that held no shame in it whatsoever, only a kind of weary, almost administrative calculation. The look of a woman recalculating a chess position rather than confronting a moral reckoning. "You've always been so good with numbers," she said finally. "I suppose I should have expected you'd find them eventually." I asked her how long she thought she could have kept finding new small numbers before one of them finally added up to something I could not ignore. "Longer than you'd think," she said, and there was no apology anywhere in her voice, not even the performance of one. People see what they expect to see. Meredith. Everyone in this family expects you to handle things quietly and expects me to be harmless. It is a remarkably useful combination, if you know how to use it. I felt something cold settle into my chest, listening to her say it so plainly, as though she were explaining a business strategy rather than confessing to years of theft from a company I had built with my own hands. I had spent 36 years assuming Deborah's dry, knowing manner was simply personality, the particular flavor of humor certain women of her generation cultivate to survive rooms full of men who never once asked their opinion. Sitting in that living room, I understood for the first time that the same dry, knowing manner had been load-bearing all along, holding up something considerably less charming than I had ever allowed myself to examine. I told her I intended to remove her from every position she held at Cole & Company events, effective immediately, and that I expected full repayment on a schedule Nora would be drafting within the week. "And if I decline that schedule," she asked, still remarkably calm, "what exactly do you imagine happens next? A trial. Your company's name across a courtroom docket for months, maybe years. Every bride who's ever booked with you wondering, quietly, whether the fraud went deeper than one ant with a shell company. You need this to go away quietly considerably more than I do. Meredith. I am 66 years old. I have very little left to lose. You have an entire company still ahead of you." I told her that I had already considered exactly that calculation, and that I was prepared to let this stay contained to a private resolution. For now, provided she cooperated completely and did not test how much patience I had left for her particular brand of quiet pressure. She studied me for a moment, the way she might study a contract clause she suspected of hiding something in the fine print. Then rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the park, wineglass still in hand, her back to me for the first time since I had arrived. "I have watched this family reward exactly 2 things for 40 years. She said, still facing the window, being adored, or being useful. "You chose useful very young, and you have spent every year since resenting the people who chose the easier path instead. I am not confessing to villainy, Meredith. I am telling you how this family actually works, underneath all the toasts and the Christmas cards. I simply understood the rules earlier than you did." She smiled then, the first real expression I had seen cross her face since I arrived, and reached for her wineglass again. "You think your father doesn't know all of this already," she said, almost gently, almost kindly, in a tone that made the words land considerably harder than if she had shouted them. "Ask him where he thinks the family trust distributions have actually been going for the last 10 years. Meredith. Ask him before you decide I am the only person in this family who owes you an explanation." I did not tell Nora about Deborah's parting comment right away. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me needed to hold it alone for a few days first, turning it over privately, before I let it become a fact other people could react to, advise me about, fold into a legal strategy. My father had occupied a particular, uncomplicated place in my understanding of this family for 42 years, the flawed but ultimately steady patriarch. And I was not ready yet to let Deborah's bitterness be the thing that reorganized that understanding. I told myself for those first few days that she had simply been trying to frighten me into silence. I mostly believed it, not completely. Victor called on a Thursday to say he had finished formalizing the signature analysis into a report that would hold up under legal scrutiny, complete with the metadata comparisons, the banking trail, and sworn documentation of his methodology. He walked me through it over video call, page by page, in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything. And by the end of it I understood that whatever I decided to do next, I now had something considerably more solid than suspicion to decide it with. This is prosecutable, he told me plainly. Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, all of it well within the statute of limitations. I am not telling you what to do with it. I am telling you what it is. I asked him, before we ended the call, whether in his experience cases like this one usually stayed contained to the person whose name was on the shell company, or whether they tended to widen once investigators started pulling threads. He considered the question longer than I expected. In my experience, he said, shell companies are rarely a solo hobby. Somebody usually helps set them up, or at minimum looks away at a useful moment. Whether that thread leads anywhere in your case, I cannot say yet. I have not been asked to look past Deborah, and I would need your authorization to widen the scope. I told him I was not ready to give that authorization yet. I did not tell him why. I was not fully certain in that moment that I knew the real reason myself. Nora and I met the following day to discuss the actual choice in front of me, laid out with the particular clarity she has always brought to difficult conversations. Going back to law school, when she was the only person in our study group willing to tell me a paper was not as good as I thought it was. Option 1, she said. We refer this to the district attorney's office. Full criminal exposure for Deborah. Likely for whoever helped her set up Renata's involvement as well. It becomes public record. Your company's name is attached to a fraud case for as long as it takes the courts to resolve it, regardless of the fact that you are the victim, not the perpetrator. Option 2. We handle it as a private civil matter. Deborah resigns from every position, signs a full confession and repayment agreement under threat of criminal referral if she defaults. And we keep this out of any public docket. You get your money back faster. Your company's name never appears next to the word fraud in a headline. I asked her what she would do if the decision were hers alone. She was quiet for a moment before answering, which was unusual for her. I would want the courtroom, she said finally. I would want every ounce of accountability the law could extract. But it is not my company. And it is not my mother who would have to sit through a criminal trial watching her own sister-in-law explain herself to a jury. This is genuinely your call. Meredith, and I will support either version of it completely. I thought about the 11 employees whose careers depended on coal and company events continuing to exist. I thought about the 19 families whose weddings had already been quietly compromised, who deserved restitution considerably more than they deserved months of public spectacle, and I thought uncomfortably about my mother, who had already stood in front of 200 people once that year and watched one daughter's wedding collapse in real time. I was not certain she could survive watching a sister-in-law's criminal trial unfold in the local paper on top of it. I want the private resolution, I told Nora, for now. But I want every piece of Victor's evidence preserved exactly as it stands, untouched, in case I ever need to change my mind. Keep it, Nora said simply. You may. She walked me out to my car afterward, an old habit of hers from law school, when neither of us liked ending a hard conversation inside a building that had witnessed it. Standing in the parking lot, she asked me gently whether Deborah had said anything else during our confrontation, anything I had not yet repeated back to her. I hesitated long enough that she noticed. Whatever it is, Nora said. I would rather hear it from you now than find it later in a deposition transcript. I told her, finally, what Deborah had said about the family trust. Nora did not react the way I expected. She did not look surprised. She looked instead like a woman filing a piece of information into a folder she had already half suspected existed, and told me, carefully, that if I ever wanted to pull that thread, she would help me do it properly, on my own timeline, and not 1 second before I was ready. Fixing Carol Whitmore's trust turned out to be considerably harder than fixing her invoice. I wired her the full $22,000 from my own personal account the same week, along with a written explanation of exactly what had happened, careful and precise, prepared with Nora's guidance to protect both of us legally while still being honest with a woman who deserved honesty considerably more than she deserved careful legal phrasing. I offered to personally oversee every remaining detail of her daughter's wedding myself. No delegation, no assistant standing in for me at a single planning meeting between now and the ceremony. She agreed to stay, which I understood, even then, was as much an act of grace as it was a business decision. Not every client would have. She told me, on the phone that day, that what had actually convinced her was not the refund itself, but the fact that I had called her personally, instead of letting an attorney's letter do the talking. People forgive mistakes, she said. What they don't forgive is finding out secondhand that someone let a lawyer apologize on their behalf. I have thought about that sentence often since, turning it over the way you turn over any small piece of advice that turns out to explain considerably more about your life than the person offering it probably intended. 2 other clients did leave that week regardless, politely, without accusation, citing timing concerns that were almost certainly not the real reason. I let them go without argument. I had learned, by then, that chasing every departing client with reassurance cost more of myself than the relationships were worth salvaging, and that the clients who stayed, the ones who let me explain and then judged me on the explanation rather than the rumor, were the ones actually worth keeping. I called an emergency vendor protection audit across every active contract in the company, working with Priya late into the evenings for the better part of 2 weeks, personally verifying every line item on every open file, cross-checking names against real, licensed, insurable businesses rather than trusting a decade of institutional habit that had apparently never once been fully earned. It was slow, exhausting work, made slower by the particular humiliation of having to explain to 11 employees, one careful conversation at a time, that a person they had trusted implicitly for years had been quietly stealing from the company the entire time, using exactly the kind of institutional trust none of us had ever thought to question. Camille asked me, near the end of that exhausting stretch, how I was managing to keep functioning at all, running a full audit and a company at the same time while everything else in my personal life had also just come apart. I told her the truth, which was that functioning had become the only alternative I could tolerate, falling apart would have to wait its turn. Louise found out everything. Finally, on a Sunday afternoon 2.5 weeks after Carol Whitmore's first phone call, I had put off telling her for as long as I reasonably could, partly to protect the investigation, partly, I will admit now, because some old and stubborn part of me still did not want to be the daughter who brought her mother more bad news so soon after the last round of it. She listened without interrupting, the same way she had listened to nothing at all the night of the wedding. And when I finished, she sat very still at her own kitchen table for a long moment before she spoke. I always thought there was something slightly performed about the way Deborah loved this family, she said quietly. I never had proof of anything, just a feeling I never let myself examine too closely, because examining it felt disloyal. I asked her whether she had ever suspected anything specific. Not specific, she said, just a sense that she was always keeping score of something, even at Christmas, even when she was being generous. I should have trusted that feeling years ago instead of talking myself out of it every single time it surfaced. Her palm settled over mine on the table, warm and steady, the same small gesture she has offered me since I was young enough for her whole hand to swallow mine completely instead of just resting on top of it. You are not responsible for what she did. Meredith, Louise said, you built something good, and someone you trusted used that goodness against you. That is not a failure of judgment on your part. That is simply what predators do to people who are generous enough to be worth exploiting. I did not fully believe her that afternoon. I have come, in the months since, to believe her considerably more. We sat together at that kitchen table for a long time after that, not talking about Deborah anymore, just existing quietly in the same room the way we had after the wedding collapsed, as though my mother's kitchen had become the one place left in my life where nothing was actively being audited, litigated, or explained. She made tea neither of us particularly wanted, simply for the ritual of having something to do with our hands. At some point she asked, almost offhandedly, whether I had spoken to Eleanor recently, whether I had ever taken her up on that strange invitation from the wedding. I told her I had not, that between the audit and the investigation, I had barely had room to think about anything else. Louise gave me a look I could not quite read, something between amusement and concern, and told me that whatever my grandmother wanted to discuss, she doubted it was going to get any smaller by waiting. I did not understand, sitting in that kitchen, how right she was about to turn out to be. We scheduled the final meeting for a Tuesday morning, in Nora's conference room rather than my own office, a choice I made deliberately. I did not want Deborah's last visit to Cole and Company events to happen inside the building she had spent 6 years quietly draining, and I did not want my staff catching so much as a glimpse of her walking through our lobby one final time. She arrived precisely on time, dressed the way she dresses for events she wants to control, tailored, understated, every detail chosen to project a calm she may or may not have actually felt underneath it. Nora had prepared the documents in advance, a formal resignation from every position Deborah held at the company, a repayment schedule structured over 4 years at an interest rate Nora had insisted on as a matter of principle rather than practicality, and a confidentiality agreement binding her from discussing any detail of the arrangement publicly, in either direction. Deborah read every page carefully before signing, the way a woman reads a contract when she has spent her whole life understanding exactly how much power lives inside fine print. She did not argue a single clause. I had half expected her to negotiate, to push back on the interest rate or the repayment timeline, some final performance of resistance before conceding the inevitable. She simply signed page after page. In the same steady hand I had watched write checks at family gatherings for 30 years and slid the completed documents back across the table without a word. Nora walked her through the confidentiality terms one final time, out loud, making certain there could be no future claim of misunderstanding. Deborah listened with the patient, slightly bored expression of a woman who had read considerably more complicated contracts than this one in her lifetime, and confirmed, when asked directly, that she understood every term and was signing freely, without duress. I remember thinking, watching her confirm it so calmly. That duress was an odd word to apply to a morning she had ultimately built for herself. 6 years and 19 invoices at a time. "I want to say something before I leave," she said finally, capping her pen with a small, precise click. I told her she could, though I made no promises about how I would receive it. She had earned no guarantee of a gentle audience, and we both understood that without either of us needing to say it aloud. "I am not going to apologize to you, Meredith," she said. "Not because I don't understand what I took from you, or what it cost you to find it. I understand both perfectly well. I am not apologizing because I think an apology at this stage would be for my comfort, not yours, and I have taken enough from you already without asking for that, too." It was, I will admit, the closest thing to honesty she had offered me since I first confronted her in her living room, and I found myself almost grateful for it. In the strange, complicated way, you can be grateful for a small mercy from someone who has otherwise given you every reason not to expect one. She stood, gathered her purse, and paused at the door of the conference room, not quite looking back at me. "For what it's worth," she said, "I never enjoyed any of it the way you probably imagine I did. It was never really about the money. It was about proving, to myself if no one else, that I still mattered to this family's finances after your father spent 30 years making sure I never had any real power inside them." I asked her, before she could leave, exactly what she meant by that. She turned back to face me fully then, and for the first time that morning, something genuinely bitter surfaced underneath the composure. "Ask your father where he thinks the family trust distributions have actually gone for the last 10 years, she said again, the same sentence she had used weeks earlier in her living room, deliberate this time, unhurried, clearly meant to land. I am not the only person in this family who has been quietly moving money where it was never supposed to go. Meredith, I am simply the only one you have caught so far." She left without waiting for my response. I sat alone in Nora's conference room for a long moment afterward. The signed document still spread across the table between us, and understood, with a cold, settling certainty, that whatever I had just closed was considerably smaller than whatever Deborah had just opened. Nora came back in a few minutes later, having walked Deborah out personally, and found me still sitting exactly where she had left me, staring at nothing in particular. She did not ask what Deborah had said on her way out. She simply sat down across from me, the same way she had sat across from me at every difficult table since law school, and waited until I was ready to say it out loud myself. She said it again. I told her finally. "The thing about my father and the trust." Nora nodded slowly, unsurprised in a way that told me she had been quietly expecting this conversation since the day I first mentioned it in the parking lot. "Then I think," she said, "it might finally be time to stop deciding whether you want to know, and start finding out. Whatever it is," she added, "you will handle it. You have handled everything else this family has quietly handed you for the last 2 months. One impossible thing at a time." I did not feel nearly as certain of that as she sounded. I let myself believe it anyway, for the length of the drive home, because some mornings believing it is the only way to get through the rest of the day still standing. The weeks that followed Deborah's resignation settled into something almost resembling normal, though I want to be careful about that word, because normal is not quite what it was. It was more like the particular quiet that follows a storm you have already survived, where the damage is still visible everywhere you look, but the immediate danger has passed enough that you can start assessing it instead of simply enduring it. Carol Whitmore's daughter's wedding went forward on schedule, and I personally coordinated every detail of it myself, down to confirming, by hand, that every single vendor listed on the contract was a real business with a real phone number that a real person answered. It was, in its own strange way, one of the more satisfying weddings I have run in 15 years. Not because it was the most elaborate or the most beautiful, but because I had rebuilt every piece of trust underneath it personally, brick by brick, the same way I had built the company itself all those years ago in a rented spare bedroom. 2 of the departed clients quietly returned once the audit results became known within the local wedding community, word traveling the same sideways channels that had nearly cost me everything a month earlier, this time carrying a different message. Cole and Company Events had found the problem itself, fixed it at significant personal cost to its owner, and made every affected family whole without waiting to be forced into it by a lawsuit or a headline. Reputation, I learned that season, can survive a genuine crisis considerably better than it survives the appearance of one being hidden. Priya and I rebuilt our vendor verification process from scratch, adding safeguards that would have caught Coastal Event Assurance in its very first year rather than its 6th. Every new vendor now required a licensed business registration on file, a second signature on any payment above a fixed threshold, and a quarterly reconciliation that Priya ran independently, without needing my approval to flag anything unusual. I found something quietly healing in that work, in turning a violation into a system, in making it structurally impossible for the next Deborah, whoever and wherever she might someday be, to exploit the same quiet, inherited trust twice. Camille joked, halfway through the process, that we now had better financial controls than companies 20 times our size, and I told her that was precisely the point. I had learned the expensive way that trust without verification was not generosity. It was simply an unlocked door with a welcome mat in front of it. Louise called most evenings that month, not to check on the business, but simply to ask how I was actually doing underneath all the fixing. A question I had gotten remarkably skilled at deflecting for most of my adult life, and remarkably poor at deflecting from her specifically. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment with a glass of wine I had barely touched, I told her the truth. I told her I felt like I had spent a month proving, over and over, that I could survive being betrayed by people who were supposed to protect me, and that some exhausted part of me was beginning to wonder how many more of those proofs I was going to be asked to produce before the year was over. I did not know, saying it out loud, how close I already was to finding out. I called Eleanor the next morning and asked whether her invitation from the wedding still stood. She answered on the second ring, as though she had been waiting by the phone for weeks, which, I would later learn, she essentially had been. I wondered when you'd finally have room to hear it. She said, "Come Sunday. Bring nothing but yourself. This conversation deserves your full attention, and I suspect you have not given anything your full attention in quite some time. Bring an appetite, too," she added, almost as an afterthought. "I am making the pot roast your grandfather used to love, and I refuse to eat all of it alone at my age." I told her I would be there. I spent the rest of that week finishing the last loose threads of the Deborah situation, closing files, confirming repayment schedules, allowing myself, for the first time in a month, to believe the worst chapter might actually be behind me. I even let myself sleep past 6 one morning, a small, ordinary luxury that felt, after everything, almost indulgent. I should have known better than to mistake one quiet morning for an ending. I spent that final week also thinking, more than I expected to, about the 220 guests who had watched my sister's wedding collapse, about Deborah signing her name on a conference room table without a flicker of shame, about how quickly a family's polished surface could crack once someone finally applied enough pressure to the right seam. I had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that Deborah's seam was the last one left to find. I had spent an entire month treating her exit as the end of the story rather than a chapter inside a considerably larger one. And some small, uneasy part of me, the part that reconciles numbers for a living and has learned to distrust totals that resolve too neatly, kept quietly insisting that the math still did not fully add up. I had no idea, driving to my grandmother's house that Sunday afternoon, exactly how right that uneasy part of me was about to turn out to be, or how much further the story actually went. Eleanor's house sits at the end of a quiet street lined with live oaks old enough to have shaded 3 generations of our family's Sunday dinners, a low, white clapboard cottage that has always felt, to me, considerably more like home than the larger, more formal house I grew up in. She met me at the door in a cardigan the color of dried sage, waved away my offer to help carry anything from the kitchen, and sat me down at her small dining table set for 2, a pot roast already resting under foil in the center of it. We ate first. I want to tell you that plainly, because it says something about my grandmother that she refused to let a single serious word pass between us until we had both finished a full plate and she had refilled my glass of sweet tea twice. She asked about the company, about the audit, about whether I was sleeping, and I answered honestly, the way I have always found myself answering honestly with her, and almost no one else in this family. Eleanor has a particular gift for making a kitchen table feel like the safest room in the world, even when, as I would soon learn, she is quietly preparing to hand you something that is going to make the rest of your world considerably less safe. She has always believed that people absorb hard truths better on a full stomach, a piece of wisdom she credits to surviving 1 husband, 2 recessions, and, as she puts it, more family funerals than any woman should have to sit through with her hat on straight. I noticed partway through the meal that she kept glancing toward the sideboard behind her, the way a person glances at a door they know they are eventually going to have to walk through. I did not press her. I had learned, over 4 decades of knowing this woman, that Eleanor Cole moves at exactly the pace she intends to move at, and that rushing her has never once, in my experience, produced anything except a longer wait. Only once we had cleared the plates did she reach into the drawer of the sideboard behind her and set a slim folder on the table between us, worn at the corners in the particular way paper gets worn when it has been handled thoughtfully, over years rather than carelessly. I want to ask you something first, she said, before I explain any of this. Do you know why Deborah dared do what she did for 6 years without anyone in this family stopping her? I told her I had wondered exactly that, more than once, in the weeks since Victor's report. Because your father let her. Eleanor said simply, not by helping her directly, as far as I know, by choosing deliberately not to look closely enough to ever have to stop her. I felt something in my chest go very still, the same stillness I remembered from the night of the wedding, right before a truth arrives that you already half suspected, but had not yet let yourself fully believe. Your father has managed the Cole family trust for 30 years. She continued. He inherited that responsibility from my late husband. And I will admit, I did not fight him for it at the time, because I did not yet understand how he intended to use it. For the last 10 years, Walter has been redirecting distributions meant to be shared equally among this family's assets, quietly, in amounts small enough to explain away individually, toward funding your sister's life, her apartment, her car, a significant portion of what she still owed on that wedding before your card ever entered the picture at all. I asked her how she could possibly know that with any certainty, because I still have my own attorney reviewing every trust filing that touches my late husband's estate, every single year, whether Walter realizes it or not, she said, tapping the folder between us. And because Deborah told me herself 3 years ago, drunk on wine at a funeral, thinking she was simply gossiping with an old woman who would forget it by morning. I did not forget a single word of it. I have simply been waiting for the right moment to decide what to do with it. I looked down at the folder, unopened, and understood that whatever it contained was going to be considerably heavier than anything Deborah had handed me in that conference room. The cover was unmarked, ordinary manila, the kind you could buy at any office supply store in the county, and somehow that ordinariness made it worse. I had expected, if I had expected anything at all, something that looked the part, a heavier stock, a more official label. Instead, it looked like something you could accidentally throw away with the junk mail, which I suspected was exactly why Eleanor had chosen to keep it looking that way for as long as she had. My hands were not entirely steady when I finally reached for it. Eleanor did not rush me, did not reach across the table to open it for me the way a less patient person might have. She simply folded her own hands in her lap and waited. The way she has waited out every difficult silence I have ever watched her sit through, at funerals, at holidays, at the wedding only weeks earlier. Patient in a way that made the waiting itself feel like a kind of care. "That is not all of it," Eleanor said quietly. "That is barely the beginning. But I think you need to hear the rest slowly. And I think, before I say another word, you deserve to actually open that folder yourself." I opened the folder slowly, the way you open something when part of you is still hoping it will turn out to be less than you fear. It was not less. It was, if anything, considerably more precise than I had braced myself for. Inside were photocopies of trust distribution statements going back a full decade, annotated in Eleanor's own careful handwriting in the margins, small notes in blue ink beside entries that meant nothing to me at first glance and everything once she began explaining them. Line after line showed transfers labeled generically as family support disbursements, sums ranging from $4,000 to nearly $20,000, occurring several times a year, every year, for 10 consecutive years. "Your grandfather's estate was always meant to treat you and your sister identically," Eleanor said, tapping one column with a steady finger. "Equal shares, equal timing, no favorites written into the original documents. What these statements show is a decade of separate support disbursements your father approved entirely on his own authority, outside that equal structure, structured in smaller pieces specifically to avoid the kind of single large transfer that would have required sign-off from anyone besides him. I did the math almost without meaning to, old habits refusing to switch themselves off even in the middle of the worst conversation of my adult life. $340,000, give or take, once I added every annotated line together, $340,000, quietly funneled to my sister over 10 years. While I built a company from a rented spare bedroom and never once asked this family for $1 I had not earned myself, I thought of the apartment Paige had lived in for the last 6 years. Nicer than her income as an occasional content creator should have reasonably supported. And the car she drove, and the down payment on the car before that one, and felt each of those ordinary, unremarkable facts rearrange themselves into evidence I had simply never thought to examine. "I have paid for physical therapy," I said quietly, mostly to myself. "I have paid for a wedding I never agreed to fund, and this whole time, there was also this..." Eleanor did not try to soften it. This whole time, she agreed. "There was also this." "Why?" I asked Eleanor, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I wanted it to. "Because your father has never believed Paige could survive without help," Eleanor said, not unkindly, more like a woman finally saying a sentence she had rehearsed many times in private. "And because helping her, quietly, on his own terms. Let him feel like the kind of father he has always wanted to believe he was, without ever having to sit with the harder truth that the help itself was making her worse, not better. He has spent 30 years solving your sister's problems before she has to face them, and 30 years assuming you did not need the same treatment, because you never once let him see you struggle. I asked her the question I had been almost too afraid to ask since she first opened that drawer. Does this connect to Deborah? To coastal event assurance? Eleanor's expression did not change, but something in the set of her shoulders told me the answer before she gave it. Deborah has always known where your father's money actually went. She said, she has known for years. I believe, though I cannot prove this part the way I can prove the trust filings, that your father has known about her company for almost as long, and chose not to look closely at it either, because looking closely at Deborah's arrangement would have meant looking closely at his own. Two people, each holding a piece of the other's secret, each finding it considerably easier to stay quiet than to risk what honesty might cost them both. I sat back in my chair, the folder open on the table between us, and felt something in my understanding of this entire family quietly, permanently, rearrange itself. I thought about every dinner where my father had introduced me as the one who handles things. Every holiday where Paige's newest crisis had absorbed the entire table's attention, while mine went politely unmentioned. Every quiet year I had spent believing that being capable simply meant needing less. I understood now that it had never been a coincidence. It had been a system, built patiently over a decade, with me cast in the one role that required no ongoing investment, because I had never once given anyone a reason to think I needed it. I set my glass down carefully, aware, in a distant way, that my hand was not entirely steady. I asked Eleanor whether my mother knew any of this. I do not believe so, Eleanor said. Louise has never once, in 40 years, been given access to the trust filings. That was your father's decision, too, made a long time before any of this began. And I suspect now for reasons considerably less innocent than he would have described them at the time. That is not all of it either, Eleanor said gently, watching my face. There is one more thing I need you to see, and I think you should sit with the first part a moment longer before I show it to you. Finish your tea, she added, in the same practical tone she had used all evening. Whatever is left in that folder will still be there in 5 minutes. You do not have to absorb the whole of it standing at a run. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, crossed to the same sideboard drawer, and returned this time with a second folder, considerably thicker than the first, bound with a simple elastic cord that looked as though it had been wrapped and unwrapped many times over many years. 15 years ago, she said, sitting back down across from me, I watched your father begin treating you and your sister differently in ways small enough that I could not yet prove them, but large enough that I trusted my own eyes. I decided, quietly, that I was not going to wait for proof before I acted. I have never needed my son's permission to do what I believe is right with my own money. She opened the folder and slid it toward me. Inside were trust documents bearing my own name, dated 15 years earlier, establishing something called the Meredith Cole Independent Trust, funded from Eleanor's personal estate rather than the larger family trust Walter controlled, administered by a trustee whose name I did not recognize. An estate attorney in Atlanta with no family connection to us whatsoever. I did not want your father administering this, or even knowing it existed, Eleanor said. Not because I do not love my son. I do, complicated as that love has become over the years. But I have watched him make decisions his entire life based on which child currently needed rescuing loudest. And I was not willing to let your future depend on you continuing to be the one who never asked for help. So I built you a door he could not see, let alone lock. I asked her how she had managed to keep something of this size hidden from him for 15 years, in a family where I had come to assume every significant financial decision eventually made its way back to Walter one way or another. Money that never touches the family trust never has to answer to the family trust, she said, a faint, dry satisfaction crossing her face for the first time all evening. This was always entirely mine to give, funded from assets I inherited separately from your grandfather, assets your father has never had any legal claim to or knowledge of. I simply never mentioned it. And nobody in this family has ever thought to ask an 89-year-old woman detailed questions about her private finances. It turns out being underestimated has its uses. Meredith, I suspect you are beginning to understand that yourself after the last 2 months. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, what exactly the trust contained. Land, mostly, she said. A parcel outside the city I purchased outright 30 years ago, along with a modest but carefully managed investment account that has grown considerably since I first funded it. The attorney administering it has been instructed, since the day it was established, to release the full trust to you upon my death, or immediately at your request, if I ever believed you needed it sooner. I am telling you about it today because I believe, watching you sit across this table, that today has finally become that day. I sat with the folder open in my lap for a long moment, unable to fully absorb what she was describing. 15 years. She had been quietly protecting me for 15 years, since I was 27 years old, working out of a spare bedroom, with no idea any of this existed. And she had never once let it show in the ordinary rhythm of our relationship, never once made me feel like a project she was managing rather than a granddaughter she loved without complication. I looked up at her, an old woman in a cardigan the color of dried sage, who had apparently spent a decade and a half quietly outmaneuvering her own son on my behalf without once asking for credit or even acknowledgement. Every Christmas card, every birthday phone call where she asked, with what I had always assumed was ordinary grandmotherly interest, how the business was really doing underneath whatever polished version I gave her, I understood now that those questions had never been idle. She had been checking, year after year, whether the door she had built was still one I might someday need to walk through. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked her. "Because you did not need it sooner," she said simply. "You built something remarkable entirely on your own, and I was not going to rob you of that by handing you a safety net before you had proven to yourself you did not require one. I was only ever going to open this door the moment I believed the family that was supposed to be your safety net had genuinely failed you instead." She reached across the table, not for my hand this time, but for the folder itself, closing it gently and setting it back in front of me, a small, deliberate gesture that felt like the handing over of something considerably larger than paper. "It is yours now," she said, "entirely, unconditionally, and completely separate from anything your father has ever touched or ever will." I asked her, finally, what she wanted me to do with it, half expecting her to have some larger plan already assembled, the way she seemed to have assembled everything else in that folder years in advance. "Whatever you decide," she said. "Rebuild your reserves after the audit if that is what you need. Buy yourself a house that is entirely, boringly yours, with no history attached to it, or simply let it sit exactly where it is, quietly gathering value, until the day you finally trust that it is real. I did not build this to control what you do with it. I built it so that no one else in this family ever gets to control what you do without it again." I did not have an answer for her that evening. I am not certain, even now, that I have found the whole of one. But I remember driving home that night with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, and understanding, somewhere past the shock, that I had just been handed the first piece of unconditional protection anyone in my family had ever quietly built for me, without asking for a single thing in return. I called Nora first thing Monday morning and asked her to clear her entire afternoon. She must have heard something in my voice because she did not ask a single clarifying question before agreeing, only told me to come straight to her office and bring everything I had. I spent the hours before that meeting sitting in my parked car outside my own office, unable to make myself go inside and pretend to run a normal Monday, rereading Eleanor's annotations until the numbers stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like something closer to a map of everywhere my family had quietly decided I did not need to be told the truth. I laid both folders on her desk. The trust distribution records Eleanor had annotated and the documentation for the Meredith Cole Independent Trust, and watched her go very quiet in the particular way she goes quiet when a case has just become considerably larger than she initially understood it to be. She read through both folders twice, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting I have never been able to read as quickly as she writes it, and did not speak until she had finished entirely. "The Independent Trust is airtight," she said finally, tapping that folder first. "Properly funded, properly administered, completely outside your father's authority or knowledge. There is nothing he can do to touch it, retroactively or otherwise. And frankly, the fact that your grandmother had the foresight to structure it this way 15 years ago is some of the cleanest estate planning I have seen in a case like this. Whoever her attorney was, they knew exactly what they were protecting against." I asked her about the other folder, the harder one. "That one is more complicated," she said, "and considerably more serious. If these distribution records are accurate, and I have no reason yet to doubt your grandmother's documentation, your father has been using his position as trustee to direct family trust assets toward one beneficiary in a pattern that likely violates his fiduciary duty to the trust's other beneficiaries. That includes you. Depending on how the original trust documents are worded, this could be grounds for his removal as trustee, potential personal liability for the misdirected funds, and in the worst version of this, exposure that overlaps uncomfortably with what Deborah already did." I sat with that possibility longer than I expected to, feeling something in my chest tighten around it. I had spent the last 2 months treating Deborah as a closed chapter, a wound I had already cleaned and dressed, and was actively healing from. The idea that her chapter might not be closed at all, that it might simply be the visible half of a considerably larger arrangement, was not one I had let myself seriously consider until Nora said it out loud in her careful, deliberate way. I asked her what she meant by overlapping. Deborah's shell company received money that originated, at least in part, from vendors and clients paying into accounts your father had some oversight of. Given his role managing family assets more broadly, Nora said carefully, "I am not yet certain how deep that connection runs. It may be nothing more than 2 people who each knew the other's secret and found it convenient to stay quiet. It may be considerably more coordinated than that. I would need to bring in a second forensic review, this time focused specifically on your father's trustee activity, to know which one we are actually dealing with." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the last 2 months rearrange itself yet again, wider each time, like a stone dropped into still water that keeps finding new rings to disturb. "Do it," I told her. "I want the full picture this time. I am done being handed pieces of this family one folder at a time and discovering, months later, that there was always another one waiting underneath it." Nora nodded, already reaching for her phone. "Before I call anyone," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually sit with the answer before you give it to me. Are you prepared for what happens if this leads somewhere your father cannot walk back from? Because based on what I am reading in these 2 folders, I do not think it is going to stay small, I told her I was as prepared as I was ever going to be, and that waiting any longer to find out was no longer a form of protection. It was just a slower way of staying afraid. Nora studied me for a moment. The way she has studied me across difficult tables since we were both 23 and terrified of our first-year exams. And something in her posture softened, just slightly, out of the careful professional register she had held for the entire meeting. "For what it's worth," she said. "Not as your lawyer right now, just as your friend. I am proud of you for wanting the full picture instead of the comfortable half of it. Most people faced with what's in those 2 folders would find a reason to stop looking right about here." I told her I had spent most of my adult life being the person who stopped looking, who filled in the gaps with the kindest possible explanation and called that generosity. I did not want to be that person anymore, not even for my own father. "Then let's find out exactly what we're dealing with," Nora said, and picked up the phone. I drove to my parents' house on a Wednesday evening, having called ahead only to say I needed to speak with my father alone, not offering a reason, not willing to risk him having time to prepare one of his own before I arrived. He met me in his study, the same room where he had signed every important document of my childhood, report cards, permission slips, the loan guarantee he had refused to co-sign the year I started my company, a refusal that had, I understood now with a bitterness I had not fully expected, apparently not extended to whatever Paige eventually needed instead. He did not seem surprised to see me, which told me, before I said a single word, that some part of him had been expecting this conversation for longer than I had. I laid Eleanor's folder on his desk without preamble and told him what I knew. $340,000, redirected from the family trust over 10 years, structured deliberately to avoid the oversight that would have required anyone else's signature. He looked at the folder for a long moment without opening it. The particular stillness of a man deciding how much of a losing hand to show before he is forced to. "Where did you get this?" he asked finally, and I noticed he had not denied a single number in it. "That does not matter right now," I told him. "What matters is whether you are going to tell me the truth, or make me sit here and watch you try to talk your way around documentation I already have." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the authority I remembered from every difficult conversation of my childhood. It sounded, instead, tired, almost relieved. The way people sound when a secret they have carried alone for years is finally being lifted off them, whether or not they are ready for that relief. "Your sister has never been able to hold on to stability the way you can," he said. "Every time I stepped back and let her fail on her own, it cost this family more in the long run than simply helping her would have." I made a judgment call, over and over, that keeping her steady mattered more than keeping the ledger perfectly even between the 2 of you. I asked him whether it had ever once occurred to him to simply tell me, to ask whether I minded an uneven ledger, rather than deciding on my own that I would never notice, or never mind, or never deserve to be consulted about money that was supposed to belong to both of us equally. "You have never needed anything from me, Meredith," he said. And there it was again. The same sentence Eleanor had predicted almost word for word 2 days earlier. "You built your entire life without asking me for help. I did not think you would even want to be part of a conversation about who needed more support. I thought I was protecting you from having to think about it at all. That is not protection." I told him, and I heard my own voice go very flat and very quiet, the way it goes right before I say something I have been holding for a long time. "That is a decision you made about my life, using money that was legally supposed to include me, without ever once asking me a single question about it. You did not protect me from anything. You simply decided I did not need to be told the truth, the same way you decided Paige did not need to face a single consequence in her entire adult life. Those are not two different values. Dad. They are the same value, applied to two daughters you decided, a long time ago, deserved different amounts of honesty. He rubbed a hand over his face. An old gesture I remembered from childhood, the one he used whenever a conversation had moved somewhere he had not planned for it to go. Meredith, he said, you have always been the strong one. I never once thought you needed the kind of protecting your sister needed. I asked him whether it had ever once crossed his mind that being called strong over and over for 42 years had simply been this family's word for a daughter it had quietly decided did not need looking after. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he asked me, almost pleadingly, what I intended to do now that I knew, whether I planned to involve the courts, whether I understood what a public dispute over the family trust would do to his standing, to Paige's, to a name our family had spent 3 generations building in this town. I told him I had not decided yet, and that I found it interesting, even now, that his first question was about the family's reputation rather than about what he owed me. That is not fair, he said quietly. Neither was 10 years of quiet distributions I never knew to ask about. I told him, we're not measuring fairness against each other tonight, Dad. We are measuring it against the truth. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I heard the grandfather clock in the hallway mark the quarter hour, a sound I had grown up with and had not thought about in years. When he finally spoke again, it was not an apology. I want to be clear about that, because some part of me had still been waiting for one, even standing there with the folder open between us. I did what I thought was right, he said. I still do not know that I would do it differently, given the same choice again. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had walked me down an aisle I never used, who had just told me, as plainly as he had ever told me anything, that he would make the same decision to shortchange me all over again if given the chance. Then I think we are finished for tonight, I said, and let myself out of the study without waiting for him to answer. Louise was standing in the hallway when I stepped out of the study, close enough to the door that I understood immediately she had not simply happened to be passing through. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her face pale in the low light of the hall sconces. And I realized, looking at her, that she had heard enough of that conversation to need no summary from me. How much of that did you hear? I asked her. Enough, she said. More than enough. I thought of every dinner in this house where Louise had smoothed over a sharp comment from my father before it could fully land. Every holiday where she had redirected a difficult question toward safer conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing it since before I was born. I had spent my whole life assuming that instinct was simply temperament, the natural gentleness of a woman who preferred harmony to conflict. Standing in that hallway, I understood it differently for the first time. It had not been temperament. It had been survival. A skill honed over 4 decades of living inside a marriage where certain rooms were simply never opened for discussion. I asked her gently whether she had known any of it, the trust distributions, the 10 years of quiet imbalance, and watched something complicated move across her face before she answered. Not the numbers, she said. I want you to believe that, because it is true. Your father has never once shown me a trust filing in 44 years of marriage, and I stopped asking to see them decades ago. After the 3rd or 4th time he told me finances were not something I needed to trouble myself with, but I knew something was uneven. Meredith, I have known for years. I told myself it was simply the shape of loving 2 very different daughters, one who needed rescuing and one who never seemed to need anything at all. I let myself believe that story because it was easier than fighting your father over a feeling I could not prove. I asked her why she had never said anything to me directly, even just the feeling, even without proof. Because I was afraid of exactly what just happened in that room, she said, her voice beginning to shake in a way I had rarely heard from her. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become real, and this family would have to actually reckon with it, instead of quietly managing around it the way we have managed around everything uncomfortable for 40 years. I am so sorry. Meredith, I chose peace in this house over honesty with you, more times than I can count. And I am only now understanding what that choice actually cost you. I did not have a ready answer for her. Some part of me wanted to tell her it was fine. The automatic reflex of a lifetime spent making other people's guilt easier to carry. But I made myself stop before the words left my mouth. It was not fine. Pretending otherwise would have been one more small dishonesty in a family that had apparently been built on them for longer than I had ever let myself see clearly. I am not asking you to fix it tonight. I told her instead, I am asking you to stop staying quiet about it starting now. She nodded, and something in her posture changed, straightened. The way a person straightens when they have finally set down a weight they have been carrying so long they forgot it was optional. I am done staying quiet, she said. Whatever you decide to do about your father, about the trust, about any of it. I am not going to be the reason this family gets to keep pretending nothing happened. I have spent enough years being that reason. I studied her face in the dim hallway light. This woman who had made me grilled cheese sandwiches after every hard thing that had ever happened to me, who had stood up in front of 200 people at Paige's wedding and said, out loud for the first time in her marriage, that her husband was wrong. I understood, watching her now, that something in her had been quietly building toward this moment for considerably longer than the 2 months since the wedding. Perhaps for years, perhaps for the entire 44 years Eleanor had referenced without either of us fully reckoning with what that number actually meant. Thank you, I told her, for saying it tonight instead of managing it away like you might have a year ago. I am trying, she said simply. I am not going to pretend I know how to do this well yet. I am only going to promise you I am not going back to the old way of doing it. I reached for her hand then, the way she had reached for mine so many times across that kitchen table over the past 2 months, and felt her fingers close around mine, steady, in a way they had not been a few minutes earlier. Whatever happens next, I told her, I would rather have you standing beside me admitting you were afraid than watch you smooth this over one more time. I have had enough smoothing over to last several lifetimes. She almost laughed at that, a small, watery sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and squeezed my hand once before letting go. The study door opened behind us before either of us could say anything more, and my father stepped into the hallway, his expression unreadable in the dim light, looking at the two of us standing together in a way that told me immediately he understood exactly what our alliance now meant for whatever came next. Louise did not move away from me, did not soften her posture into the smaller, more accommodating shape she has worn in front of him for as long as I can remember. She simply stood there, beside me, steady, and let him see it. The second forensic review took considerably less time than the first, partly because Victor already understood the shape of this family's finances from the Deborah investigation, and partly because my father, once he understood the full weight of what Nora and a trust litigation attorney she brought in were prepared to pursue, chose not to fight the process the way I had half expected him to. I want to be precise about why he did not fight it, because I think it matters, and because it would be easy to mistake his cooperation for remorse. It was not remorse. Nora explained it to me plainly during one of our strategy calls. Contesting a fiduciary breach this well documented in front of a judge would have exposed him to considerably more personal liability than simply agreeing to step down and negotiate a resolution privately. My father, whatever else he is, has never once in his life made a decision that was not, underneath everything, also a calculation. The resolution took 6 weeks to finalize. Walter agreed to resign as sole trustee of the Cole Family Trust, replaced by an independent trustee, a trust attorney with no family connection to us whatsoever, following exactly the model Eleanor had used 15 years earlier without any of us knowing it existed. The redirected distributions were addressed through a combination of repayment and a formal adjustment to future trust allocations, restoring the equal structure the original documents had always specified. None of it happened in a courtroom. All of it happened on paper, through attorneys, in exactly the quiet, methodical way I have come to understand is the only kind of justice this family seems capable of surviving. I want to be honest about something before I move past this part of the story, because it would be easy to tell it as though the resolution arrived cleanly, tied neatly with a bow, everyone exactly where they belonged by the time the last document was signed. It did not feel clean while I was living through it. It felt, most days, like slowly excavating a house I had lived in my entire life and discovering load-bearing walls I had never once been told were hollow. I sat across from my father exactly once during those 6 weeks, in a conference room considerably more formal than his study, surrounded by attorneys instead of family photographs. He signed each document without argument, his handwriting steadier than I expected, and did not attempt, even once, to explain himself further than he already had in that hallway. I do not know whether that restraint came from genuine understanding or simple exhaustion. I have decided it does not matter enough to keep asking. Eleanor came to 2 of those meetings, uninvited by anyone but herself, sitting quietly in the corner of the room in her sage cardigan, saying almost nothing, watching her son sign away 30 years of unilateral control with an expression I could not fully read. Afterward, in the parking lot, she told me only that she was glad she had lived long enough to see the door finally open the way she had always hoped it eventually would, even if she had once feared she would not be here for it. I asked Nora, near the end of that process, whether it bothered her that none of it would ever become public, that my father would never have to answer for any of this in front of anyone beyond the small circle of people who already knew. Sometimes, she admitted. But I have learned, doing this work for 15 years, that the goal is not always punishment loud enough for strangers to witness. Sometimes the goal is simply making sure the person who was harmed gets made whole, and making sure the structure that allowed the harm to happen gets dismantled, so it cannot happen again to the next person standing in your position. You got both of those things, Meredith. That is not a small outcome, even if it never makes the local paper. I found, sitting with her assessment, that I mostly agreed with her. I had spent 2 months wanting, at various points, considerably more dramatic outcomes than the one I ultimately got. Courtroom reckonings, public accountability, some clean, satisfying moment where the people who had wronged me were forced to answer for it in front of an audience the way I had been forced to answer for nothing at all, standing at the back of my sister's wedding in a dress that would not show up well in photographs. What I got instead was quieter, and in its own way considerably more thorough. An independent trustee who would answer to no one's favoritism ever again. A restored ledger, verified line by line. A mother who no longer smoothed over what she saw, who had finally, at 68 years old, decided her own eyes were worth trusting. A grandmother whose 15 years of patient protection had finally, openly, become mine to use. No longer a secret she carried alone. It was not the ending I would have written for this story 6 months earlier. I have come to believe it may be a better one. There was, However, one piece of it I had been quietly avoiding the entire 6 weeks. One that had nothing to do with attorneys or trust documents at all. In the middle of untangling my father's decade of quiet imbalance, I realized, almost with a start, that I had not spoken a single word to Paige since the night her wedding collapsed. Not a call, not a message, not even the kind of terse, obligatory text families send each other around a shared crisis simply to confirm everyone is still alive. I had been so entirely consumed by Deborah, and then by Walter, that my own sister had somehow become the quietest, least examined thread in the entire unraveling, which felt, once I noticed it, like its own strange kind of unfinished business. Paige texted me first, 3 days after the trust resolution was finalized, a short message asking whether I would be willing to meet for coffee. No explanation attached, no indication of what she wanted to say. I sat with that message for the better part of a day before responding, turning over every possible version of the conversation that might follow, before I finally wrote back a single word. Yes. We met at a small coffee shop near the river, neutral ground, chosen deliberately by both of us, I suspect, precisely because neither of our homes nor our parents' house would have let either party leave easily if the conversation went badly. She was already seated when I arrived. 2 coffees on the table, mine made exactly the way I have taken it since college, a small, unspoken acknowledgement that some parts of 34 years of sisterhood had apparently survived everything else. I noticed, sitting down, that she looked different than she had at the wedding, thinner in the face, dressed plainly, none of the practiced polish she usually curates for any camera or audience, real or imagined. I did not know yet whether that was grief or exhaustion, or simply what Paige looks like when she has finally stopped performing for anyone at all. I asked her, before she could begin, how she was actually doing underneath whatever she had come here to say. She laughed, a small, unhappy sound. "Nobody has asked me that honestly in weeks," she said. "Everyone either wants to comfort me or wants to make sure I understand how badly I behaved. Nobody has just asked." She did not begin with an apology. I want to tell you that honestly, because it would be simpler to describe this scene as a clean reconciliation. And it was not that. She began by explaining, in a voice that started steady and gradually lost its footing the longer she talked, that she had spent the 2 months since the wedding trying to understand her own version of events, and that the version she had arrived at was not especially flattering. But it was, she believed, honest. "I fell in love with Grant before I let myself admit I had," she said, "and once I admitted it, I told myself a story where it was fine, because you two seemed unhappy anyway, because I deserved happiness too, because somehow my happiness and your happiness had gotten tangled up in my head as things that had to compete with each other instead of things that could just both exist. I do not expect you to forgive that story. I am only telling you I finally see it for what it was." I asked her, evenly, whether she understood that the timeline mattered, that falling in love with someone while he was still engaged to your sister was not a neutral fact she got to soften with the word eventually. "I know," she said quietly. "I have known for a while. I let myself avoid knowing it clearly for a long time, because knowing it clearly meant admitting I was not the person I wanted to believe I was. I did not tell her it was fine. It was not fine, and some part of me understood, sitting across that small table, that pretending otherwise would have been exactly the kind of quiet, over-functioning grace I was trying to stop offering people who had not yet earned it. I told her instead that I appreciated her honesty, that it mattered to me more than an apology would have, but that I was not ready to promise her anything about what our relationship looked like going forward. "I am not asking you to promise anything," she said. "I am asking whether there is still a door open at all, even a small one." I thought about the black card, about the 14 months of physical therapy, about a wedding planned entirely in secret using a trust she had never once questioned the source of. I thought about Eleanor's folder, about Deborah's cold living room, about my father's unrepentant study. There is a door, I told her finally. It is not the same door it used to be. I am not going to fund your life quietly anymore. Not with my money, not with my silence, but I am not closing it completely either. I think that is the most honest answer I have for you today. She nodded, tears finally slipping free, and did not ask me for more than that. I understood, watching her accept it without pushing, that it might be the first fully honest exchange we had managed in years. I asked her, before we parted, what she and Grant intended to do now, whether they were still together, still planning some version of the wedding that had collapsed so publicly. She told me they had married quietly at this courthouse 2 weeks earlier. No guests, no dress, no cake, just the two of them and a clerk who processed marriage licenses between lunch breaks. It felt right, she said, to start it the plain way. After everything the elaborate way had cost, I did not know how to feel about that piece of news, so I let myself feel several things at once and did not try to sort them into a single tidy reaction. We did not hug when we parted, which felt correct for where we actually were rather than where either of us might have wanted to be. She thanked me for coming. I told her I was glad she had asked. It was not resolution, not fully. It was, I thought, driving home afterward. Something closer to a beginning, unglamorous and uncertain, which felt like the only kind of beginning either of us had actually earned. I ran into Grant 3 weeks after that coffee with Paige, entirely by accident. At a supplier showroom I visit twice a year to review new linen and rental inventory for the coming wedding season. He was there for his own reasons, something to do with a renovation client's event space, and we very nearly walked past each other before he recognized me among the fabric samples. There was a moment, right as our eyes met, where I braced for something, though I could not have told you exactly what. Anger, maybe grief, some echo of the particular vertigo I had felt standing in that ballroom watching him scan the crowd for someone to blame. Instead, standing there among bolts of ivory and champagne-colored linen, I found something considerably smaller waiting for me. A mild, almost clinical curiosity about how strange it was that this man, who had once occupied the entire architecture of my future, now registered as barely more than an acquaintance, I was mildly surprised to run into at a supplier showroom. I thought, standing there, of every version of this exact moment I had rehearsed in my head over the previous 8 months, lying awake some nights constructing entire imagined conversations, sharp and devastating, the kind of thing you compose in the shower and never actually get to deliver. None of those rehearsed versions had prepared me for how anticlimactic the real moment would turn out to be. I had spent so much energy bracing for a collision that never came, only to discover, standing among the linen samples, that the actual encounter required no bracing at all. He looked older than I remembered, or perhaps simply more tired. The particular fatigue of a man whose life had not gone the direction any of its architects, himself included, had originally intended, I felt, looking at him, something close to sympathy, distant and impersonal, the kind you might feel for a stranger whose hard year you happen to overhear about secondhand. "Meredith," he said, and I noticed, with a kind of distant interest, that my name in his voice no longer carried any particular weight at all. It used to. That morning, in a warehouse full of table linens, it simply sounded like a name. "Grant," I said, and left it there, unadorned, not cold, just accurate. He asked, somewhat awkwardly, how the company was doing, clearly aware of at least some version of the rumors that had circulated through the local wedding industry that season. I told him the company was doing well, which was true, and did not elaborate further, because he was no longer someone entitled to the elaboration. There was a time, not so long ago, when I would have felt obligated to fill that silence, to soften it, to manage his discomfort the way I had spent years managing everyone's discomfort in this family. I let the silence simply sit there instead, unmanaged, and found it did not actually require managing at all. "I heard about Paige and me," he said, "that we told you." "I know," I said. "She told me herself." He seemed to want to say something else. Some version of an explanation or an apology that had been sitting unused since the wedding. And I watched him visibly decide, after a moment, not to attempt it. Perhaps he understood, the way I had come to understand watching my own father in that study, that an explanation offered 8 months late, unprompted, in a linen showroom, would serve his comfort far more than mine. "Take care of yourself, Meredith," he said finally. And I told him the same, and meant it in the mild, distant way you mean well wishes for someone whose fate no longer has any bearing on your own. I finished selecting linen samples for the spring season after he left, methodically, the way I do every year, and found myself genuinely surprised, driving home afterward, by how little the encounter had actually cost me. 6 months earlier, the mere thought of standing 3 feet from Grant Whitfield would have required an entire evening of bracing myself in advance. That afternoon, I had simply looked at fabric samples, had a brief, unremarkable conversation, and gone back to comparing champagne-colored linen against ivory under the showroom lights. I understood, somewhere on the drive home, that this was what actually letting go felt like. Not a dramatic reckoning, not a final, satisfying confrontation. Just an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in which a man who used to be the center of your entire imagined future became, without ceremony, simply someone you once knew. I called Louise from the car, mostly because I wanted to say the realization out loud to someone before it had time to fade back into the ordinary texture of the day. I told her I had seen Grant, and that I had felt almost nothing, and that the almost nothing itself felt like the strangest, most significant thing that had happened to me in months. "That is not nothing, Meredith," she said, after a pause. "That is the whole thing finally finished healing. Nothing does not feel noticeable. What you are describing sounds a great deal more like peace." I turned that word over for the rest of the drive home, testing it against the quiet, steady feeling still sitting in my chest. Peace. It was not a word I had expected to reach for, not after everything the last 8 months had required of me. But sitting in traffic, ordinary Savannah traffic, no crisis waiting at either end of the drive, I found I could not immediately think of a better one. I went back to Eleanor's house the following Sunday, and this time I asked Louise to come with me, a small, deliberate gesture that felt considerably larger than the invitation itself. The 3 of us had never once, in my entire life, sat together in a room with nothing left to hide from each other. I wanted to know what that actually felt like before I let myself believe it was real. Eleanor made the same pot roast, insisted again that we eat before we discussed anything of substance. And for the first hour, we simply talked the way families are supposed to talk, easily, about nothing in particular. Louise told a story about a mistake she had made teaching her very first class, decades earlier, a slide projector disaster involving an entire tray of upside-down photographs that made Eleanor laugh so hard she had to set down her fork. I found myself laughing too, genuinely, in a way I had not managed in months, and understood, somewhere in the middle of it, how much I had missed this specific, uncomplicated version of my family. the one that had apparently existed underneath all the other versions the whole time, waiting for enough honesty to clear a path back to it. I watched my mother across that table, easy and unguarded in a way I had rarely seen her around Eleanor, and thought about how strange it was that the two women who had quietly protected me the most, in entirely different ways, across entirely different decades, had never once compared notes with each other until circumstances finally forced the comparison. I wondered how much pain, across how many years, might have been avoided if the women in this family had simply been permitted to trust each other with the truth a little sooner. I did not say that out loud. Some realizations are better held quietly, turned over privately, than spoken into a warm kitchen still enjoying its first easy hour in longer than any of us could probably calculate. After the plates were cleared, Eleanor reached across the table and took both of our hands, one in each of hers, an old woman anchoring two generations of women who had each, in their own way, spent decades absorbing more than they should have had to. "I want to say something to both of you," she said, and I could hear, for the first time all evening, a slight unsteadiness in her voice that had nothing to do with age. "I am 89 years old. I do not know how many more of these Sunday dinners I have left to give you. I spent 15 years quietly protecting one of you from a danger I could see coming, and could not yet prove. I spent considerably longer than that watching the other one absorb far more than her share of this family's difficulties, without ever once being asked whether she wanted to. I am not going to spend whatever years I have left watching either of you go back to the old way of doing things." Louise reached over and covered Eleanor's hand with her free one, and for a moment the three of us simply sat there, connected, in a kitchen that had quietly outlasted every version of this family's dysfunction, long enough to finally host an honest conversation inside it. "I am proud of both of you," Eleanor continued. "I am proud of you, Louise, for finally saying out loud what you have known for years. And I am proud of you, Meredith, for turning over every rock in this family until you found what was actually living underneath it, even when I suspect part of you would have preferred not to know." I asked her, only half joking, whether she had any other folders left in that sideboard drawer I should be bracing myself for. She smiled, the first fully unguarded smile I had seen from her since this entire ordeal began. "Not for you," she said. "I believe I have finally given you everything I was holding. What you do with the rest of your life is entirely up to you now." She studied me for a moment longer, something warm and searching in her expression, and asked the question that would end up staying with me considerably longer than anything else said at that table. "Now that you have it, Meredith, all of it, the truth, the trust, the freedom nobody handed you until you went and found it yourself. What exactly do you intend to do with the rest of your life?" I did not have a rehearsed answer for her. I had spent so many months in pure reaction, moving from one revelation to the next, closing an account, hiring an accountant, confronting an aunt, confronting a father, that I had not once stopped to ask myself what came after all the confronting was finished. I told her, honestly, that I did not fully know yet, and that not knowing felt considerably less frightening than I would have expected it to a year earlier. "That is not a failure to answer," Eleanor said, smiling again. "That is simply what an open door looks like before you have decided which direction to walk through it. There is no shame in standing in the doorway a while, looking around, before you choose." Louise squeezed my hand under the table, a small private gesture just for the two of us, and told me, quietly, that whatever I chose, she intended to actually be present to see it this time, not managing it from a careful distance the way she had managed so much else in her life. I drove home from Eleanor's house that night slower than I needed to, taking the long way along the river, in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere in particular. For the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I found I did not need to be anywhere at all. I simply needed to keep driving, unhurried, toward whatever came next. A year passed, the way years do once you stop measuring them by the crisis that defined the one before, gradually. Then somehow, all at once, I want to tell you what I did with everything Eleanor asked me to consider that Sunday evening, because I have thought about her question often since, and because I think the honest answer matters more than a tidy one. Cole and Company Events is larger now than it was before Carol Whitmore's phone call ever came in, which still surprises me some mornings when I look at the calendar. Word travels strangely in an industry built on trust, and once the full story became known, quietly, through the same sideways channels that had nearly destroyed my reputation a year earlier, a different version of it began circulating instead. Not a story about fraud, a story about a woman who found the rot in her own company and burned it out herself rather than waiting for someone else to discover it for her. Brides, I have learned, respond to that story considerably more than I expected them to. We booked out 14 months in advance this season, the longest waiting list in the company's history. The Cole Family Trust operates now under an independent trustee who has never once, in a full year of oversight, needed to explain a single distribution to anyone's satisfaction but the trust document's own plain language. Paige receives her equal share, on schedule, alongside mine. Nothing more and nothing less. For the first time in her adult life, measured against an actual standard, rather than my father's private calculations. I do not know whether that has changed her fundamentally. I know it has removed one particular lever my father used to hold, and that alone feels like something worth having fought for. My relationship with my father remains complicated in ways I do not expect to fully resolve, possibly ever. We speak at family gatherings now, civilly, carefully, two people who understand something essential about each other that neither of us particularly enjoys knowing. He has never apologized, not really. Not in the way I once imagined I needed him to. I have made a strange kind of peace with that absence. I no longer require his remorse to know my own version of events is true. Victor's report, Eleanor's folder, the restructured trust documents themselves, all of it exists independent of whether my father ever finds the words to say he was wrong. Some truths do not need anyone's confirmation to remain true. Louise and I talk most days now, not out of obligation, but because we have both discovered, somewhat late, how much we actually enjoy each other's honest company once the managing stopped. She started attending a painting class last spring, something entirely her own, unconnected to any of us. And the first time she showed me a canvas she had made, lopsided and a little too bright and completely hers, I understood I was watching my mother become a slightly different person than the one who raised me, one with room left over for things that were not about holding this family together. Eleanor is still with us, still sharp, still occasionally producing an unmarked folder from that same sideboard drawer, though nothing since has rivaled the two that changed my life that Sunday evening. I visit her most weeks now. We have never once run out of things to talk about that are not related to money, secrets, or the various ways this family has learned to fail each other. It turns out my grandmother is simply good company, a fact I spent 41 years too distracted to properly notice. Paige and I remain somewhere in the middle distance, not fully close, not fully estranged. We exchange messages every few weeks, ordinary ones, about nothing important. The kind of contact that does not demand either of us perform a reconciliation neither of us has fully earned yet. I do not know if we will ever return to what we were before Grant. Before the wedding. Before I learned exactly how much of my generosity had been quietly counted on, rather than genuinely appreciated. I have made peace with not knowing, Some relationships heal on a timeline you do not get to set in advance, and I have stopped trying to force one. I never remarried. Not that anyone has asked, though I have, for the first time in a long while, allowed myself the occasional dinner with someone who has no connection whatsoever to this family's history. No context for the wedding, the trust, the audit, none of it. There is something quietly restorative in being, for a few hours at a time, simply a woman having dinner, rather than a cautionary tale the whole county has an opinion about. I think often about the version of myself who sat at the back of that reception a year ago, in a navy dress chosen specifically not to photograph well, waiting for a card to decline. She thought closing that account was the hardest thing she would do that year. She had no idea. Sitting there with her untouched glass of sparkling water, how many more accounts were waiting to be closed? How many more silences were waiting to be broken? How much further the truth actually went once she finally let herself go looking for the whole of it instead of the comfortable, manageable half. I do not regret any of it. I want to say that plainly, because I think it is the truest thing I have to offer you at the end of this. Not the wedding, not the audit, not the folder in my grandmother's sideboard drawer, or the conversation in my father's study, or the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding a company one verified vendor at a time. I do not regret discovering exactly how much of myself I had spent protecting people who had never once asked whether I wanted the job. Freedom, I have come to understand, is not the moment the account finally shows a zero balance owed. It is not the satisfaction of watching someone else's carefully built story collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty. It is the specific, quiet moment when someone you love reaches toward you expecting the same old rescue, the same silent yes, the same generosity that was never actually a choice, and you finally, calmly, without guilt curdling underneath the word, tell them no. I closed one account at a wedding in a room full of white roses and thought, for one brief moment, that closing it would be the hardest and last thing I ever had to say no to. It was only the first.